Locked away, Chapter 1. All day, Ash had been feeling a bit odd. His head was a little fuzzy, and his entire body ached beneath his clothes, though he could not recall why. Ash, Clement, Bonnie, and Serena were passing through a small town on their way to Victory Road. Having just collected his final batch, he was well on his way to his 6th league tournament. This time he would walk away champion. This time was different. Ash could feel it. Unlike other regions, Kalo's infrastructure was classic and large. Buildings, even in smaller towns, were 3 times larger than anywhere else he traveled so far. Each town was memorable in its own way, for one distinct reason or another. So, as they crossed through yet another nameless town, the smell of multiple vineyards penetrated his senses. He couldn't see them, but he was sure that somewhere around the rustic, antique buildings, that were miles of grape fields ready to harvest. Ash sniffed happily, embracing the many different cultures he had found over the years. Every region had a characteristic of its own, Kalo's was no different. Its majestic ruse came from romantic lights, carefully placed signs, and authentic, old-fashioned restaurants that the group walked by. Typically, Ash found joy in every aspect of the journey, every new scent, every new sight, every new and exciting adventure, but today he was feeling more sluggish than ever before. Even the mouse resting on his shoulder was heavier than his typical weightless. Ash wondered if it might have been something they ate, because yesterday, they were energized and ready to win their first championship match. Instead, Ash thought that Pikachu looked painfully ill. "You sure you're okay, buddy?" Ash asked while scratching the electric Pokémon's ears. It squealed at him happily, eliciting a loud sigh while it hopped down from his shoulder and into Ash's arms, where the worried trainer then cradled it. Clement raised his eyebrows and smiled. "He's probably just tired, Ash. I wouldn't worry so much," the blonde laughed with a wave of his hand, as Bonnie ran up ahead. "Oh, look guys, there's an ice cream shop. Can we stop there?" Bonnie jumped gleefully. Ahead of them was an out-of-place, red and gray diner. Matched with old-fashioned awnings to cover the street, and large, circular windows. He didn't think too much about the idea that it seemed out of place, and instead, Ash tried his best to muster a smile, but the dull ache from earlier that morning pounded the joy from his face. Clement and Serena answered for him with their own cheers of excitement. "That sounds great after our long walk, don't you think, Ash?" Serena turned to him, smiling as brightly as the sun, but Ash returned the gesture weakly while he rubbed his stomach, feeling very hungry. No matter how much he ate lately, he was never satisfied. A look of worry washed over Serena's face as Clement ran forward to follow his younger sister into the ice cream cafe. "Are you feeling okay, Ash? You've been acting kind of funny since yesterday," she said coolly while extending her hand to brush his forehead. Her hand never made contact, however, as the 10-year-old boy pushed himself away and shook his head. "I'm fine, just a little hot is all," he muttered half-heartedly. Eventually he looked up, using his hand to shield the rest of the light that his hat didn't cover. The sun hadn't shifted from its noonday position even though after their walk into the city, it should have been well into the evening by now. Ash didn't have long to think about it because the boiling heat made his throat dry. It was also winter last he checked, wasn't it? He tugged on his collar slightly, burning up as he swallowed against a lump that formed in his throat, and followed Serena into the parlor behind his friends. When the doors opened, a cold gust of wind smashed into him, knocking the breath out of him. Trying not to wince, he trudged through the ice cream shop, forcing a smile to his lips as he took a seat beside Serena in the booth. Bonnie and Serena both sat beside the window, carefully plucking out menu items that sounded interesting while Ash placed Pikachu on the corner of the table. It wasn't very often that Ash let Pikachu have ketchup, but on days celebrating his most recent entry into the championships, he would treat the Pokémon. "Here Pikachu," Ash muttered happily, handing a bottle of smashed tomato to the yellow Pokémon, but he merely shook his head, and crawled down from the metal table and back into Ash's lap, where it curled up into a slight ball against his stomach. Ash's face scrunched up as he removed his hat. "I don't think Pikachu is feeling well, guys," Ash muttered while fanning the small Pokémon. He stroked its yellow fur while his companions raised their eyebrows and smiled softly. "Like we said, he's probably just tired." Serena paused, brushing her hand through her short hair after removing her own hat. "We all are," she added with a curt smile. Ash couldn't muster the same feeling of confidence because he still felt an embroiled heat threatening to burst from his chest. Maybe he was the one feeling unwell? The leather seats of the booth had no feeling beneath his legs. Instead, he felt like he was floating, drifting into a haze of his own world when the waitress approached them. "What will it be for you folks?" she asked, having red hair and a cheerful, pale smile. She had gorgeous cerulean green eyes that Ash felt looked oddly similar to someone else that he knew, but neglected to mention it before his friends started their orders. "I'll have a chocolate sundae," Bonnie exclaimed. It was also Ash's favorite dessert. "Me, too, actually," Ash added to Bonnie's order quickly as the waitress scratched down the information and smiled happily at the group. Serena ordered a fancier dessert, with Clement opting out of dessert altogether, in favor of fries. Ash could have gone for some fries as well, maybe even a full burger. "Actually, can I get a burger and fries, too, with a glass of ice water?" he added quickly, feeling the pit in his stomach worsen. The waitress smiled that oh-so-familiar grin and tilted her head slightly. "Sure can, just give us about 10 minutes. With a nod of her head, and a spin of her heels, she was off into the kitchen where she tossed the staff the order before stalking off to another group at another table, who Ash couldn't see the faces of. Stroking Pikachu's fur habitually, Ash rubbed the back of his neck with the other, lost in his own thoughts while Bonnie talked with Serena, and Clement picked at one of his newest inventions, the replacement of Pokeball transfer systems. It would have been super handy, considering the fact that most of the time a trainer needed to trade his Pokémon. They were in the middle of nowhere, far, far away from a Pokémon Center. However, as the swirl of the ceiling fan hummed above them, Ash found it hard to keep his focus, almost like he was being drained from the inside out. Seconds later, even though the waitress had told them 10 minutes, their meal was ready. The green-eyed waitress set Ash's meal down first, with the glass of ice water, and then stalked off to grab the ice cream and Clement's fries. Worriedly, the smell of food was lost to the young trainer who picked at his burger, relating the taste to tree bark or cardboard. "Does this taste stale to you?" he grumbled, pushing the plate to Clement. Serena looked worriedly at Ash, this time touching his head. He felt normal, so she shrugged. "You must have caught a small cold or something," she hummed thoughtfully, while sipping her shake. Ash shrugged in response and drifted into his own chocolate sundae, and thoughts. As his eyes opened and closed lazily, he thought for a while that falling asleep would be a wonderful feeling. Once or twice, he dozed off, listening carefully to the unstructured scratches of Bonnie's pencil against white paper. She and Serena were designing a new look for Serena's showcases. Those two were always so creative. When he opened his eyes again, everything took a white hue. Clement looked like he was glowing while he tinkered with his screwdriver, and hummed a random song to himself. A few tables away, Ash could finally see the face of the lady a few rows down from him, a young woman with auburn hair and brown eyes. Her face was pale white, and stony. But familiar. When he saw that face before, she always smiled at him. There was never any room for worry unless she was angry, which was rare. "Mom?" Ash asked, his voice waking him from his trance. Everything returned to normal, even the waitress whom he associated with, that had red hair and a slender body, walked around a bit chubby and had brown hair. He shook his head, feeling the slight head rush. What was that? He thought, but didn't have long to decide as he looked at Serena and Bonnie, who did not hear him speak. "Did you say something?" Bonnie looked up to Ash with her big, doe eyes, and while sparing a single glance back at the table where he saw his stone-faced mother previously, he shrugged. "It's nothing," Ash said, looking at the elderly couple, who fed a toddler spoonfuls of baby food. He felt better though, even though he hadn't touched his food, his stomach no longer felt like it had a gaping hole in it. In fact, his entire body felt lighter, but his mind betrayed him. A thought ran through his head briefly: when was the last time he had money? "How are we paying for this?" he asked suddenly, catching his companions off guard as the notion dawned on him. "It's on the house." "Said who?" Ash said flatly, looking around the restaurant. Everything not only had a happy, sunshine glow, where everything was right in the world and everyone was his age or extremely old, but it suddenly felt too clean, too perfect. Not quite right. Ash swallowed hard while looking down at Pikachu, who had disappeared from his lap. He dipped his head down to look under the table, but the Pokémon was no longer there. He then sat up and looked around the table. "Where did Pikachu go?" Ash murmured, but his companions shrugged. "Who?" Serena asked with her lips pursed happily. Instantly, Ash's face fell. Anxiously, he stood in a hurry as a second wave of pain rocketed into his chest. "We should go, guys," Ash murmured. Preparing to go, he stopped when he caught a glance of Pikachu sitting happily on the table, sipping his bottle of ketchup. "Ash, you're causing a scene. Sit down." Bonnie yelped, waving her hand at the trainer, but Ash licked his lips, and shook his head. However, he sat back down at Bonnie's insistence, though his gaze circled the diner distraught. "Something is wrong," he muttered, though he couldn't place what was bothering him. Pikachu walked up to him, and sat down with his ketchup to his lips and blinked up at his trainer. His foot bounced on the black and white tiled floors. He felt like he had been there for ages already, so when he glanced at the clock and saw that it hadn't changed, his heart raced. Maybe he was overworking himself the last couple of days, rushing from town to town to collect different kinds of Pokémon and win badges. He never seemed to stop, he just kept going, and going. Maybe battling was finally getting to him? Ash rubbed his hands over his head, scratching his hair as he tugged on his red cap. But he had to work hard, he had something to prove to the world, he had to be the very best. Breathing in a fresh smell, rather than the smell of the coffee pot, ice cream-laden restaurant, he held his nose. The area smelled like latex gloves, and slowly, the sound of a ticking clock distracted him. He watched the second hand go around once, and again, but the minute hand never changed. Tick. 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 The slow beeping in his head pulled at his ears. The soft sounds blasted in his ears while Clement tugged at his project, and Serena tore up the design she just made. SCCRCH scratch. The sound of paper ripping echoed loudly in his head. He pressed his hands against his ears harder, but no one seemed to notice, and the sounds didn't get any quieter. Drip, drip. The leaking faucet beside the waitress poured into his ears like a screaming engine in the middle of the night, or a blazing chainsaw in the dead of a forest. Without realizing it, he put his hands over his ears, as if to silence the outer noise, but it only made it worse. "I can't take this," he screamed loudly, silencing the once noisy diner. Even with his scream, the echo of the sounds didn't end. Blasting in his ears were the sounds of his friends, only his friends had stopped what they were doing to look up at him. His friends stopped, but the sounds did not. Was he going crazy? He couldn't take their stares, their desperate looks of worry, so instead he rose to his feet, kicking against the table and causing Serena's shake to spill over the table, as well drowning Bonnie's picture in a mud of melted pink ice cream. "Ash! What are you doing?" Serena cried while taking a few napkins off the table to pat the drawing as the waitress, the one Ash had recognized earlier with red hair and green eyes, returned. She ripped a cloth out of her apron, and laid it out flat over the mess while Ash looked upward at the ceiling, feeling it pull further and further away. Beep. 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 Was he hearing things? The sound of a microwave, an alarm? He looked over at the counter, spooked. He was gathering more and more looks by the second. Pika Pi? The small rodent asked, but Ash shook his head violently and sprung forward as if some other force was guiding him. Outside. He needed to go outside. Striding boldly, he moved to the exit doors, leaving behind cries from his group. Something wasn't right, he could feel it in the way the wind caressed his face. The noon sun was still up, but it was cold. So cold, and yet he was burning up just a few minutes ago. He touched his hands to his face, wiping a cold sweat from his forehead. Shaking, he tucked his hands under his armpits. The temperature was frigid. Had the temperature dropped in the last few minutes? It wasn't this cold earlier. Ash was freezing. Ash, wake up, dear. What? He spun around. Serena, Bonnie, and Clement still watched him from inside the restaurant, trying to clean up the mess that Ash left behind. He turned once more to his left, and again to his right. Nothing. Nothing but the cold wind. He could barely even feel the weight of Pikachu on his shoulder. Shivering, he started forward into the middle of the street, walking past moving cars, adamantly questioning what was happening. If he started moving, he would surely warm up, right? It only made his feet heavier. After a few steps, he could hardly walk. What in the world was happening to him? Unfortunately, his legs gave way in the middle of the street, forcing a car to halt to an impressive stop to avoid him. His legs buckled from underneath him, and he was on his knees in seconds, wheezing for air. By that point, Serena had come running out of the diner, calling Ash's name. Ash! Someone call a doctor! Anyone! She screamed. Ash heard her voice waver, tears bordered her eyes when she turned him over to look at her. He felt so cold, and she was so warm. Tenderly, she pressed her warm palm against his cheek while Pikachu folded itself onto his chest, but the kind gesture only knocked the wind out of him. When he tried to speak, only short coughs escaped his lips. It's going to be okay. Serena cried. He could feel the warmth of her tears hitting his face as everything started to go dark. It's going to be darkness. When his eyes closed, it was all he could see. Nothing to the left of him, and nothing to the right. It was worse than a dream. In fact, he never remembered dreaming, he just knew traveling, and laughter, never darkness. He couldn't comprehend what was happening to him, the normal day ending so abruptly. Cold and clammy hands had grasped his shoulders, as if shaking him, but Ash was numb already. His mind was elsewhere, somewhere far away. And for the first time in many years, Ash was terrified. There was a long moment of silence until the rushing of those small ticking noises and beeps flooded his ears. You're absolutely sure you want to pull the plug, Miss Ketchum? Even though it sounded like he was underwater, he could hear a man's voice. An older man, one who took his life too seriously. And then something he wasn't prepared for. Tears escalated, he could feel them cascade down his cheeks, only they were not his own. Yes, I'm sure. His mother's voice wreaked havoc in his body, remembering that stone-faced woman who sat in the booth down the ways from him. He wanted to scream at her, to ask her what was going on, what was happening to him, but the sudden, sharp spike of pain followed by her tears only forced his mind to scream out. Swirling pain enveloped his entire body, slowly suffocating him until all that he felt, all that he could think, all that he knew, was nothing. Locked away, Chapter 2. Viridian City. Misty had countless pleasant memories of the vast city. Most of them consisted of first dates, Pokémon victories, and underwater ballets, but she cherished them all. Returning to the city, however, was always partially bittersweet, because for every pleasant memory of the city, there was one memory that hadn't been so pleasant at all. The red-haired female stepped off of the green and brown train cart in 3-inch heels. She wore a pair of black tights as pants, with boots that ended right under her kneecaps. She looked almost like a model in her flowing, sheer white blouse that ended above her mid-thigh. Sleeves covered her arms loosely, and the neckline hung off her shoulders, clearly revealing the top of her blue tank top that she wore beneath. In the midst of summer, there was no reason to cover up completely. In fact, she was already rethinking the boots, but her sisters had told her that any good woman did not wear flip-flops outside of pool and beach areas. Sneakers were for kids, and so boots were her only spare. Reluctantly, she listened to their silly fashion advice, and no matter how absurd it may have been. Boots in the middle of summer? The redhead grunted as she lugged her semi-large white purse over her shoulder. Passengers shuffled around her carelessly while strands of her hair fell into her face. Her hair was styled in a layered bob that curled right beneath her ears on both sides. It puffed a little more in the back, and hung a little longer on the right side. Usually she wore her hair up in a ponytail, but when she left the gym the few times she did, she tried to look presentable by applying a bit of makeup, side-sweeping her bangs rather than letting them hang in her face, and wearing jewelry. Cascade water drops dangled from her ears, with a matching silver necklace. Around her, she had already gathered looks from prepubescent teenage boys with too much acne and a bad odor while she shuffled her feet forward on the hot concrete. A part of her wished that Viridian City had spent a little more time building their train station. Sure, even though it snowed in Kanto rarely, there wasn't a good reason to not have a roof over the loading platforms. It was too hot. What if it rained? Everyone would be running for cover and failing. Misty grimaced as she adjusted her dark sunglasses. Whispering began moments after she approached the ticketing station to verify her arrival. Getting it stamped meant she could get half off her next purchase, anything to save a few dollars. Young trainers, occasionally older ones as well, turned to one another. Boys stood behind her in line, muttering to one another. "Isn't that the Cerulean City gym leader? I heard she has a mean streak." The small one replied. Misty cracked a small smile, listening to the boys whisper about her greatness. "Who cares who she is? Look at that ass. She has a booty I would." He didn't have time to finish as the gym leader spun on her heels, and faced the boy behind her with demonic eyes. She glowered at him, flicking down her black patrol shades with a look of intense fury. Sea green eyes were the portals to hell, if those boys didn't know any better. "Who the hell do you think you are? Watch your fucking mouth," she growled, cracking her knuckle as a vein popped on the side of her cheek. Like clockwork, the two whispering teens turned, and fled the scary woman, doing their best not to trip as their tails tucked between their legs. She flicked off her glasses in one motion and cocked her mouth to one side with a sigh. The Cerulean City gym leader, Misty, in all of her red-haired glory, folded her arms in a huff as she turned back to the ticket counter. The man stared at her timidly, and slipped her signed ticket back to her before she smacked her lips and began her stroll down the walk while muttering, "Stupid kids don't know any manners," and shuffled her sunglasses into her bag. Due to standing circumstances, she didn't have the patience for teenagers anymore. As a water Pokémon trainer, and the Cerulean City gym leader, she spent a majority of her time wearing a swimsuit at the gym. Unless challengers were under the age of 12, she couldn't catch a break with the comments. Even when she was dressed properly, people commented on her looks. "The ugliest sensational sister, my ass," she thought bitterly as she pushed through the exit doors with a little more aggression than reasonable. Greeting her outside the doors were the roaring sounds of the city, which was only slightly maintained by the high walls of the train station. The rush of different noises, honking, yelling, alarms hit her with a loud sigh, and she hummed while holding the strap of her bag. Breathing in the pollution, she smiled once more, her fit having passed. Yes. Viridian City had so many pleasant memories, she thought with a smile. As she strolled eagerly through the encapsulating town that had changed so much in the last few years, she kept her shoulders high, and confidence radiated from her. On the main street, buildings were high, some up to 20 stories. Silphco was the largest business in Viridian City, and their logo could be seen on every bus and nearly every street corner that she passed. Abruptly stopping her stride, she looked past the street lights and the busy streets. Littered along the sidewalk beside the train station were the bodies of the homeless, claiming to have been ran out of their homes by some evil force. They held out their dirty hands for money, and Misty had a hard time telling them no. Years ago, she tried to pass around what little she did have, but found that there was simply not enough. So now, she tried to avoid the beggars, though it made her heart heavy to do so. When the walk light flashed on at the intersection, and the cars stopped, Misty pressed onward without passing a glance to the outstretched hands. About a block away from her destination she exhaled, looking up at the large, metallic pokeball that hung at the end of the street indicating the Pokémon Hospital. The Pokémon Center, which used to only be a shell in the center of the city, was now a multi-processing, mass-marketing, fully operating Pokémon hospital, and just so happened to be where she was heading. The hospital had recently released a new brand of Pokémon food from some guy under an alias from Pewter City. It completely renovated how beneficial Pokémon food was. As the decent, and good-natured gym leader that Misty was, she didn't mind the short travel and extra money to provide her Pokémon with the absolute best. Along with that, Misty liked the city. They had a plethora of stores that Cerulean City didn't offer, and the atmosphere was a bit more forgiving. No other city was like Viridian City. Since Team Rocket had been undermined, and the former Viridian City gym leader, Giovanni, brought to face charges by the police, the theft rates were down by almost half. Little kids roamed the street free of worries. Aside from the homeless corner right outside of the train station, people were able to relax in the city. Even the elderly could relax, sip tea and enjoy their day without a care. Really, there wasn't much Misty could think she disliked about the city. Outside of the homeless corner, the suburbs of the city were maintained, and there were a plethora of available jobs. When Giovanni was put behind bars for his crimes, Silphco opened several new branches of their company, thus, allowing the market to boom. Nearly every corner of downtown was littered with sidewalk cafes that allowed people to sit out in the sun, enjoy the gentle breeze and the sound of swaying tree. Misty happened to be walking near one of the sidewalk cafes when an article that was on the back of an open newspaper caught her eye. An elderly woman sat in a black metal chair, flipping through carelessly when Misty rushed to the railing of the small diner and pressed her fingers against the metal fence. "Turn back to that last page," Misty crooned to the old woman, getting a disgusted look in return. "Get your own paper," she shrieked, loftily slamming the paper down on the table, so that neither female could read it. Misty gave the older woman a snarl, rolling her eyes as she did. "How immature!" Ignoring the woman, Misty turned on her heels, and took off down the street. Rushing to the next newspaper bin, which happened to be down the street and across from the Pokémon Center, Misty scrounged through her purse to pull out a few quarters. She slipped them inside of the coin slot, and then watched the latch release eagerly. A loud shriek echoed from the box as metal rubbed against metal when Misty pulled the door down and dipped her hand in to take out a single, neatly folded paper. Cursing at herself for forgetting, it took her a few frustrated moments to look through the first 3 pages as she hadn't even been sure what she saw was what she really saw, or why she cared even the slightest about it. As she made it to the 3rd page, she grimaced, news about a coma patient that was so quickly glanced over. Deflated, Misty deadpanned and shook her head. It wasn't what she thought. "Man dies in coma, 6 days after fatal accident," she read aloud before lowering the paper. A wave of relief washed over her, but it only lasted a moment before she handed the paper off to some man leaning against the wall. While there were many great memories around Viridian, there was one looming, depressing reminder. Namely memories of a young trainer named Ash Ketchum. XOX. It took her several hours before she worked up the courage to walk to the hospital. The twilight sun died in the distance, and showed no signs of easing up. The heat had long since penetrated her boots, and she once again swore to herself that boots were a terrible idea. Staring at the large infrastructure before her, She carried a plastic bag full of Pokémon food in one hand, her purse on her right shoulder, and a bundle of white roses cradled in her right arm. Her green eyes looked upward at the tall, multicolor building with an intense sadness in them. She hadn't realized the date, otherwise she would have been here a few days earlier. Every year on July 22nd, for the last 10 years, she made a customary stop at the Viridian City Hospital. It didn't matter if she was busy, if she was sick, or injured, she found a way here. Every year except this one. Sure, over the last few years, she had lost any hope for the frail boy she visited, but even to this day, she felt slightly responsible. So every year, she would visit. Maybe it was fate that she decided this week to spontaneously vacation from the gym? Maybe something good would happen? Maybe she wouldn't spend 10 hours with what was essentially a corpse. Dusting curtains, cleaning nails, and trimming hair, for someone that hadn't even made a slight notion of living in the last 10 years. Aside from the fact that his results never came back negative, he was on life support, he was fine. Only, he wouldn't wake up. Disheartened by her own thoughts, Misty entered the building after scaling a few steps, and then approached a plump woman seated behind the front counter. "Hello, I'm here to visit an Ash Ketchum. He should be in the long-term care unit." Misty spoke quietly, tapping her fingers on the top of the desk as if partially ashamed that she still visited. She knew that her sisters made jokes about it, but she couldn't help but think somewhere, even if it was a very small place, it helped the dying boy. Maybe put him at peace just a little. "Your name?" the woman asked in a sickly sweet accent. "Misty Waterflower." A few moments, clicking on her keyboard, she pursed her lips. "I'm sorry, I don't see a Mr. Ketchum in the long-term care unit," she said to the gym leader, looking at her with wide, empty blue eyes. Misty blinked. Was he moved? "Could you just search for Mr. Ketchum?" she tried, but the nurse didn't seem to care. "I'm sorry, are you family?" she asked in an uppity tone of voice that made Misty shiver. "No, but I visit every year," Misty tossed out, clearing her throat. "I'm sorry ma'am, that's not good enough. The family has asked that he not be disturbed during this time." "During this time? During this time for what?" Every nerve in Misty's body had started to violently twitch as she licked her lips. Deep down, though she tried to hide it, she always had a bit of a temper. "Just look up my name then, I'm on the visiting list, I promise." "I'm sorry, I can't help you," the pudgy nurse suggested with a snooty tone. Misty cracked her neck, then slammed her palm against the countertop. The sound echoed among the tall ceilings and alerted a few visitors. Misty didn't yell, she didn't scream, rather, she hissed. "Listen, lady. I'm the ma'am that fucking carried him in here 10 years ago, now give me a damn room number or so help me I will." She stopped herself, refrained herself from threatening the poor woman's life, she was just doing her job, after all. But Misty could tell that the lazy, absent-minded woman had rethought her situation. "Just let me look you up in our system," she stammered quickly, flicking her fat fingers against the keys once more until she let out an elated sigh. "I'm sorry, you are on the visitors list," she half squealed, causing Misty to roll her eyes. Of course she was on the visitors list. "His new room is on the 8th floor, room 856. Enjoy your visit." The nervous woman squeaked out the words so quickly that Misty almost didn't catch them as she took her visitor's pass, and then took off. She ripped the sticker from its parchment, and slapped it against her left shoulder without writing a name. So long as she had the pasty yellow tag, people would know that she was a visitor and wouldn't bother her. Yay! On her way to the elevator, she hadn't thought much about the room change, but she knew that something wasn't right. Long-term care was on the 5th floor. Ash had a nice room there, blue curtains with wooden stands that supposedly made the room feel more homely. Why they would change his location after so many years? She wasn't sure. Though, the hospital was flooded with plenty of other coma patients, some not lucky enough to have a name. There were several John Does that Misty had visited during her first few years, but as time went on, she realized just how minimalist those flowers were to them. There was no misunderstanding that once a person was in a coma for over a year, typically, the brain cells would start dying. Most people who didn't wake up after the first month were removed from life support, but Delia, this boy's mother, just knew that her son would wake up. Misty remembered the moment like it was yesterday. She had followed this silly boy she fished out of the river to find her bike, only to stumble upon him passed out and electrocuted in the middle of the road. Misty scoffed under her breath and shook her head as she waited in the elevator with a nurse. In the beginning, Misty asked many times, "What's the difference between being shocked and being electrocuted?" The simple answer, people who were electrocuted didn't get back up. Of course, she didn't know that as an 11-year-old, no, all Misty saw was a half-dead boy with a Pikachu curled in his arms who needed help and she panicked. Misty didn't know CPR at the time, or really any form of first aid, so she did the only thing she could do. She threw him over her shoulder, and carried him into Viridian City, where eventually a nice officer named Jenny intercepted, and took them the rest of the way. His Pokédex had been fried in the explosion, and Misty could only assume that because of the power boost of the thunderstorm that day, as well as the metal bikia, the shock of the attack was just too much. If a Pokédex, designed to be nearly indestructible, had essentially turned into smolder, Misty wasn't even sure how the boy survived, let alone make it all the way to Viridian City with her practically dragging him. With a beep from the machine beside her, Misty arrived on the 8th floor with a heavy heart as she exited the elevator with a sigh. Only the soft tap of her heels against the floor provided sound for this section of the hospital. After the initial accident, she had stayed in Viridian City for 2 weeks in order to send out flyers and articles or anything else that could help identify the boy. Luckily, an auburn-haired Pokémon trainer, who heard the news from Misty's sisters in Cerulean City, rushed back to Viridian City to address the situation. To this day, Misty could barely remember that boy's name. The name Oak flashed in her mind like a sore thumb, but she couldn't be sure anymore. After his arrival, he called Ash's mother, DNA tests were ran, and it was all verified. Back then, Misty thought that if she found Ash's mother, it would relieve the pain in her chest, but it only made it worse. So much worse. When she saw Delia for the first time, that look of absolute horror reflected in her eyes as she broke down at the sight of her son was a moment Misty would never forget. Misty hoped she never had to go through something like that. Ever. Since then, everything changed slowly over time, everyone but Ash. Delia started off peppy, hopeful, and visiting religiously for the first 3 years, but over the last couple of years she must have drifted. Misty neared the boy's room knowing that everything was different now as she put the situation together in her mind. The room change, the time to grieve, public visitation revoked. She gnawed on her thumbnail. Years and years of waiting was hard on the participants, devastating, even. Misty couldn't blame Delia for her decision. Empty beds lined the other rooms, and only a single nurse worked the floor, smacking her gum haphazardly while she texted on her cell phone. She didn't even notice Misty enter the hospital room. Trembling hands squeezed the doorknob, and then twisted it slowly until she was standing inside of the last hospital room that Ash Ketchum would ever see. The 8th floor was for terminal patients. XOXs. When Misty finally got settled in, she took the time to review his charts that were left at the end of his bed. A request was put in from a Ms. Ketchum to have the life support machines disconnected, only 2 days ago, on July 22nd. His birthday. After that, she disappeared without alerting the doctors even though she was supposed to stay until his condition ended. The mother probably couldn't live with the idea that she had to pull the plug on her own son, and because she couldn't deal, she ran. Had Misty been here on the 22nd like she was supposed to, she might have actually had enough time to talk some sense into Delia. Yet, how was that Misty's business? Misty didn't have the pay the hospital bills, deal with the pressure of living with the idea that her son was locked away in a coma for years. No, Misty could put it out of her mind easily enough the moment she stepped off of the hospital's steps. Delia most likely thought about it every day, every night, every moment, and Misty only visited once a year. However, something about pulling the plug after waiting 10 years left her frosty. Before taking a seat in the only available chair in the dark room, Misty took her time dressing the white roses. Hospital staff moved what few possessions that he had from his previous room into this white jail cell, including the pale blue vase she bought for his flowers over 6 years ago. She got tired of putting the flowers into small, styrofoam hospital cups, so she bought a new one. One that would bring color to an otherwise gray area. Next, she fluffed out the white curtains, and pulled them open to let in the twilight sky. When the dying sun fell over Ash's face, she could see how sick he was becoming when he was no longer connected to life support. She gave him credit. Most people died within the first couple of hours, some within the first few minutes, but he was a fighter, even if he was a vegetable. His cheeks were practically concave, his skin a pasty white and cold and clammy. If Misty couldn't hear the heart monitor in the corner, beeping occasionally to let her know that he was still breathing, she might have thought that he died hours ago. Apparently, it was inhumane to euthanize human beings, so instead of just ending it, he had to die slowly in a pile of his own encrusting filth. Misty could barely stand to look at him, a skeleton of his former bright-eyed self. Those chocolate brown eyes that stared up at her the moment she fished him out of the river plagued her on her visits. Misty covered her mouth thoughtfully. This was all just so wrong. It wasn't fair that Ash's life was over just like that. Tapping her heel on the floor, a thought crossed her mind. She wouldn't look at him like this, it was barbaric to do so. Quickly, she hung her purse and plastic bag off the side of the chair before setting off in a fine huff. She stepped out of the room long enough to grab a few rags off the sanitary clothing rack, a fresh gown, and some sanitary gloves. Offering only a passing glare at the neglectful nurse, Misty spun around and re-entered his room quietly. Without caring about her hair, which took a little longer than she cared to admit in order to set perfectly, she tossed it into a quick bun, and then ditched her fancy blouse in favor of the practical blue tank top she wore underneath. Carrying a bucket from the bathroom plump full of lukewarm water, she placed it onto the floor beside his bed, and dipped one of the washcloths into it. The gloves offered adequate protection while she gently started to wipe his face off, removing some of the grime and oils that had formed there. While he wasn't nasty, with a catheter insert and only liquid drops, he still wasn't clean either. In the long-term care unit, he was sponge-bathed every day, but here, they only offered the bare minimum, a bed and coverings. The persistent foredrip had even stopped and was left unchanged thanks to the delinquent nurse on this floor, and for a moment, Misty wondered if she should walk out and report the nurse, but at the rate Ash was decaying, she doubted that he would make it through the week regardless. It was awfully humane to even keep N4 connected when his lungs were probably crashing as each heartbeat droned slower. Misty walked away from him for a few moments to fetch a spare 4 bag. Inserting a needle into a human wasn't any different than inserting one into a Pokémon, and Misty had long developed said skill. She nipped and changed the 4 bags before pulling out the fresh gown. Previously, she had thrown off his blankets, now, she had thrown off his old gown, and replaced it with the new one, only bothering to snap the buttons together behind his neck, and then gently flapping the others around the shoulder. That was more than the other nurse had done, at least. He was clean, and while he was far from the living world, he was taken care of. With her task complete, Misty used her forearm to wipe away a stray sweat. Removed her gloves and tossed them into the garbage bin and then reached down into her purse to grab some nail trimmers. The worst thing about blaming herself for an accident that unless she had thrown herself on top of the boy and pummeled him back then was unavoidable, was the persistent, stinging guilt that forced her to perform these kind gestures, even when the death sentence had already been drawn up. She felt like she had to do these things, as if it would ease her own mind to know that she had helped, if only a little. Misty grimaced. He should at least be able to die with some dignity, no? And so, like she had the last 10 years, she plucked and trimmed at his nails, taking careful time not to cut him or break the skin. His skin was almost paper thin, translucent in the sunlight. Each vein until his elbow was visible like some kind of blue and purple mix of wires. The sight made her sick, but she pressed on until the task was complete. It wasn't like he could help it. Once she finished, she was able to ditch her second set of gloves, clean up, toss the dirty laundry into the empty hamper, and return to her seat where she pursed her lips uncomfortably, watching him. At the least, she thought he would look a little better after theta, but he didn't look different. He was still dying. Still grey. She couldn't change that. And so she sat, with one knee crossed over the other, cradling her chin with her hand, watching this young man die before her eyes. His body becoming his eternal tomb. XOXs. Misty hadn't meant to doze off, no, she was supposed to leave almost an hour ago. Stretching, the gym leader let out a yawn while rubbing her eyes to clear the sleep. Inhaling the musty scent of the room, she glanced at Ash's paling face one last time before pulling her sheer blouse back over her blue tank top. Leaning over his bed to get a good look at his face, she gently placed her right palm against his left cheek, the same one she had slapped so many years earlier. It was almost ironic, poetic even. She chuckled as sadness seeped into her eyes. Ash, she started, and then pressed her lips gently against his forehead before pulling away sullenly. I'm so sorry this happened to you. She spoke softly, turning her entire body away, lingering her fingers along the fresh bed sheets. Wait. The voice was so weak it almost sounded like a whisper. Had Misty been anyone other than who she was, she might have even thought that she imagined it, but the weak grip that snatched her wrist, the hands that had only a few hours ago been as numb and lifeless as her doll collection was, holding her wrist in such a way that shivers ran down her entire body. Frozen in fear, she could see it, very briefly, but it was there, dark chocolate eyes staring up at her in complete panic. Misty? He questioned hoarsely, weakly, and for the second time, his heart rate machine spiked. The death-lurching scream that followed from the gym leader not only woke the dead, it woke the sleeping nurse at the station. Locked away, Chapter 3. After Misty called for the neglectful nurse, the doctors swarmed in shortly after. A near-full panic breached the hospital staff that evening. Misty, who was backed up into the corner of the room, had an older, gentler nurses approach her, and kindly asked her to leave. She was shell-shocked, and horribly confused. Maybe a little bit terrified at the same time. Ash, while awake, looked sicker now than he did sleeping. With so many doctors poking at him and shifting his bed, she wasn't entirely convinced that he wasn't a zombie. Misty was about to be escorted out of the room by said gentle nurse when Ash spoke again. His voice sounded quiet and dangerously scratchy from years of unused vocal cords. She stays. Ash groaned. Talking created a mass amount of pain. His heart rate spiked again. A nurse ran in with some items from a cart, holding a portable oxygen tank while another doctor used a flashlight over Ash's eyes several times. We need to get him into ICU right away. The doctor croaked, ignoring Ash while addressing his staff. He then rattled off a few more instructions, about medicine, oxygen levels while a nurse shoved a needle into Ash's left forearm. Blood surfaced, and Misty shivered at the sight. Having been called away, the gentle nurse returned to help her co-worker, thus leaving Misty standing between a rock and a hard place. Should she leave? The doctors said leave, but as quickly as they asked, they seemed to forget her existence as their primary focus turned back to Ash. The hospital staff loaded Ash's bed, kicked off the brakes, and started him towards the exit, blazing right past Misty. Ash shook his head as they moved him, disgruntled and confused, passing in and out of consciousness. Unlike the doctors who were all work, Misty could see the complete terror pouring out of his eyes. Ash didn't have a clue where he was, but somehow, he recognized who she was. She could tell that he didn't like that he was being moved, from wherever he was, and even tried to sit up, but was knocked back from his own weak and ill body, causing vibrations as the doctors rushed him into the elevator. Misty stood in the hallway like a deer in headlights as he was wheeled away. She could only watch, unable to speak until that look of panic on his face turned to one of fear and betrayal. Once he was loaded into the elevator, Misty finally had the nerve to speak again. "I'll still be here when you get back," she screamed, cupping her hands in front of her mouth so her voice would carry. Once the elevator doors had closed, she placed her hand over her mouth, thinking there was nothing else that she could do. Hearing her call after him, even though he was confused, was oddly comforting. The last thing he remembered was collapsing in the middle of the street of that unknown town, but even that seemed so hazy. Misty looked so different. His body ached. The lights above him in the elevator hurt his eyes. His thoughts couldn't untangle and he tried to touch his aching head, but found that he could not lift his own arm. How long had he been out? Where did Serena go? Did they think he was going to die? Because he sure as hell felt like it. He felt like he had been asleep for years, but that couldn't have been right. Only yesterday he won another badge. He was about to go to the Kalos League Championships. He raised his hand as if to impose a question, but the doctors had strapped his hand down after the last attempt. Honestly, he wasn't quite sure he had the strength to lift it, regardless. "You need to rest and take it easy." The same older nurse that had told Misty to leave the room lumbered over his face, speaking quickly. Too quickly, Ash barely understood anything they were saying. In fact, everything seemed kind of blurry. Shit, he's coding, get a and like that, he was out like a light. XOX. Morning arrived much faster than it had the last time. He didn't feel like he was in an endless, dark void. No, morning came like it had every day for the last 10 years of his life. Brown eyes cracked open at the first light of dawn to the sound of beeping to the left of him and the distant hum of an oxygen tank. When he tried to move, he felt restraints on his wrists, but even those were too heavy for him to lift right now. His bones felt too heavy to lift. Half-baked, possibly drugged out of his mind, he finally forced his eyes open just enough to get a decent view of his surroundings. A clean, white room with blue curtains stared back at him. He inhaled sharply, and then exhaled again, testing the strength of his lungs. At least his body felt better today than it had yesterday. Still, he felt so tired. He turned his head very slowly to the door which was located to the left of his bed, and then to the heart monitor and then the 4, which was pumping some type of brownish gold liquid, beside an oxygen tank. Scrunching his face, he could finally feel the hoses that had been pressed into his nose, and they suddenly itched like crazy. Wiggling his face to distort the feeling, his eyes closed heavily, like they wouldn't open again, and then slowly he peeled them awake. Time seemed to jump. For a moment, Ash thought to call out, but a flicker of red hair outside his door kept his words tucked under his tongue. There she was again, a weird Misty that looked like Misty, but wasn't Misty. He made a face while she came into perfect view as she talked with the nurse that Ash vaguely remembered from yesterday. Misty was still wearing yesterday's outfit, her hair was messy, curly where it shouldn't have been and black rings decorated the bottoms of her eyes. She probably hadn't slept. That was typical Misty. Ash thought that she looked older, much older, but why? He inhaled, and as if thinking about her made her ears burn, she looked over at him, and then nearly jumped out of her skin while she started to push the nurse into Ash's room. Once the nurse realized where she was being pushed to, she, too, hustled in her step. "Ms. Waterflower, please wait outside," the nurse said while taking a step into the room and cracking the door shut. The nurse came around to the left side of Ash's bed, where he stared at her with weak, questioning eyes. It was funny, hearing Misty called by her last name. He would have laughed, if he had the energy to do so. "What's going on?" he asked finally, feeling a bit foggy. They must have been pumping him full of drugs because his mind moved in slow motion. It would take weeks to get those drugs fully out of his system, he thought inwardly. The nurse didn't reply. Instead, an oddly familiar tap outside of his room forced his eyes to shift back over to the cracked door, where he could see a beady sea green eye peeking in. For the first time since this craziness started, he cracked a soft smile at Misty's absurd antics. His smile almost made her heart do a flip. She shrunk away from the door the moment their eyes made contact, and pulled out her phone while stepping further down the hallway. Buried in the depths of her phone was a single name that she had never called, Delia Ketchum. Misty licked her lips hesitantly. Having not gone to her hotel that night, she ended up sleeping in the hospital waiting room. Her lips were dry and tasted like bad coffee. She tapped her finger on Delia's name, and then tapped the edges of her phone, trying to decide if she should call or not. The hospital already tried Delia's home number several times since the boy miraculously woke up, but could not reach the woman. With doctors screaming it was a miracle, and his recovery speed unprecedented in the field of science, the news media was already flooding the hospital trying to get a word with the doctors who had only 2 days ago removed Ash from life support. It was raving news, streaming on the television behind her in the waiting area. Luckily, the news reporters weren't allowed in the ICU, so Misty was left alone, not that they would bother her anyways, and Ash was left undisturbed. Though, it was not likely Ash Ketchum's story would go region-wide for some time. She hoped that was the only reason Delia wasn't picking up her phone. She didn't know yet. Still, Misty thought that it wouldn't hurt to try, so she clicked the call button. After a few minutes, she was met with the same dial tone that the hospital got when they tried to call. Frustrated, Misty pinched the bridge of her nose, unable to understand how the hospital allowed this woman to pull the plug on someone without updating their contact information. Grimacing, she pulled the phone away from her face, and clicked the end call button. Stepping back in line of Ash's room while crossing her arms, she peered in once more to see that he was looking at the nurse attempting to take a blood sample and rambling on about something. He clearly didn't like needles. His face was scrunched up in discomfort as he looked towards the window. If only he knew just how many needles he had over the last 10 years, he might not look so terrified. Misty turned away once again, placing her hands on her hips and her phone back into her pocket. She leaned up against the door frame outside of his room, hands in her pockets, waiting patiently for the nurse to finish her routine. When the nurse finally did step out, she did so shaking her head. The action caught Misty's attention and she reared her head at the nurse, who looked gravely concerned. "What's wrong?" Misty asked, voice full of worry. The nurse inhaled and then offered her a sweet smile as she guided the young woman down the hall a ways. "Ms. Waterflower," the way that the nurse addressed her so professionally made Misty almost feel like an adult. She cracked the faintest of smiles as the nurse continued. "We've never seen such a quick recovery, he's already talking." She stammered, but shook her head, regaining her thoughts. "If you choose to visit with him, please, do not mention his current situation. He does not seem to be aware of his predicament, and I would like to consult a psychiatric doctor to have him assessed before the news is broken to him. These kind of things take a lot of time to heal. Do you understand?" The nurse spoke gently, in a manner that calmed Misty's frantic heart as she laid a wrinkled hand against Misty's shoulder and smiled. Misty nodded and offered a slight smile in return. She wasn't dumb enough to go against professional advice, and the sweet nurse didn't appear malicious. Misty nodded. "I'll watch what I say," Misty assured her before the nurse smiled and went on her way with Ash's chart. Most likely on her way to speak with said doctor. Misty inhaled as she turned, heart racing, and pushed Ash's door open. He didn't notice her at first, the tap of her heels having become simply background noise as his droopy eyelids found their solace in the light beaming in behind the blue curtains. Even in his drug-induced state, his eyes were full of life and brightness. He blinked once, and then a look of frustration crossed over his face. She watched his fingers wiggle in their restraints, and then she exhaled, putting 2 and 2 together. With haste, she slid her purse onto the ground beside Ash's bed. He jumped in response as she trod across the room and then ripped the blue curtains open with one swift, refreshing act. When the light poured into the dreary room, he exhaled happily. The warm sun against his skin was almost a foreign feeling that brought a tingly feeling to his arms. While he thought it was early morning, Misty knew that the sun was already setting again. Ash had slept over 24 hours, with a few awake moments he didn't seem to remember. Her task complete, she turned at him and slipped into the blue chair to the right side of his bed and wiggled her phone between her hands nervously. Ash could only smile at her as an uncomfortable silence settled soon after. He wouldn't speak first, he had no idea where to start with his mind as scattered as it was, and so she pursed her lips and blinked her long lashes at him. "How are you feeling?" she murmured. "Honestly." Ash tried to chuckle and shifted slightly beneath his covers. His voice was barely there when he motioned to his arms, which had regained some of their color overnight, and didn't appear as transparent. She snapped her eyes back to his, having caught herself staring, only to see that his eyes had closed again, and slowly reopened. Probably a side effect of having been comatose for so long. "Yeah, honestly." Misty nodded, assuring him. Surprisingly, his answer came quickly, "Muggy. Sore. A little uncomfortable." He shifted, and Misty could only assume he was referencing the catheter and had to stifle her own laugh. Ash continued. "Confused. Super tired, and did I mention sore?" He ended by looking at her intently, catching the color in his face again for the first time. She cracked a smile. "That sounds about right," she offered with a flinch as she crossed one knee over the other. Her callous answer raised his eyebrows. "Why so short? You're usually such a chatterbox," he asked skeptically, craning his neck a little to look out the window. His hair fell behind him in that moment, and she finally realized how long it had grown as a blush fell over her cheeks. She covered her face, humiliated. How in the world did he remember how often she would ramble, rant and carry on when she came to visit? What if he remembered all the weird stuff that she would bring up? No, it must have been some subconscious memory. She grimaced and knit her eyebrows, returning her attention to him yet unsure of how to reply. Catching her discomfort, he watched as she swiped her bangs loose, letting them fall into her face like she did when they were kids. "We're still kids." He wasn't sure. "You changed your hair. It looks nice." He finally managed, pointing very gently with his finger. "I change my hair a lot." Misty flushed, surprised that he remembered what she looked like. Was it possible that the last thing he remembered was her slapping him, and then stealing her bike? Boy, that would be a great memory to have on repeat for 10 years. He grinned, or at least tried to. "You actually look like a girl." Misty almost shot to her feet, ready to yell a lot changes in 10 years, but had to refrain from doing so. Teetering on the end of her seat, she twisted the hem of her white blouse into her fingers. "That tends to happen since I am a girl," she managed. Change the subject, she warned herself. "So, do you remember anything?" He seemed stunned by the question and blinked at her a few times. Maybe it was too much of a personal question? Misty wasn't sure. Perhaps she shouldn't have even asked, but as she watched his eyes roam around the room in a fog, she gulped. What if he didn't remember anything at all? What if he was simply in a dark void for years? Ash couldn't think right away what happened. His memory was fuzzy at best, but he was sure it was because of the medication they had pumping into his veins. However, he did know a very prominent feature was missing from his room, and he inhaled sharply. So much so that his skin-tight chest seemed to raise nearly 2 inches. "Where's Pikachu?" he questioned rather than answering her, leaving Misty to scowl. While his eyes schemed around the room, to the window, the small bathroom and all of the moving tables, she wondered if Pikachu was the last thing he remembered. She guessed that would make sense, since he was trying to save said Pokémon from a flock of Spearow during the accident. "Your mom has him." She shifted awkwardly. That was a normal, decent answer, right? Ash grunted in response, as if only now catching on that something was off about the entire situation. Clearly disgruntled and upset that Pikachu was gone, he looked around the room once more for some kind of time, or date, but when nothing came up, he stared back at his one lifeline, Misty. She stared back with those deep, sea-green eyes. If his mom took Pikachu, Ash must have been out for weeks. Then again, why would Misty be here, and not his mother? It simply didn't make sense. Then, panic flooded his system. Hopefully he hadn't missed the championships. What about Clement? And Serena? Or Bonnie? Did I miss the championships? How long was I out? His sudden overload of questions as he blinked nervously made Misty suck in her lips. She gnawed on the bottom one, and Ash didn't miss that look in her eyes. Who? She muttered softly, looking painfully at him. His brain didn't seem to catch on right away. Disorder sprayed with anger fueled his next comment. You know, the group of people I traveled with in Kalos. You know them. She shifted in her chair. This must have been what the nurse warned her about. She raised her eyebrows and tried to keep a calm, thoughtful expression, but Ash no longer seemed to care. Kalos, her voice, barely over a whisper, caused him to wince. Her words physically hurt him. As an afterthought, Misty shook her head, and as a mother would a child, placed her hand over his, attempting to soothe his anger. He didn't like that though. In fact, it made him angry. He shook his head. If he had more strength, he would have ripped his hand away from hers in a fit. Her obscure answers were driving him crazy. Instead of answering him with an answer, she answered him with more questions. She wasn't acting like Misty. Cut the crap, Misty. Stop dodging my questions. What's going on? He said quickly, catching Misty off guard. While his words started out powerful, they quickly dwindled into a toxic, worrisome confusion as he gazed down at his lap and arms. He wasn't stupid, he could clearly see that something was all wrong. At his outburst, she sat back and released his hand from hers. She wanted to spare a glance at the door and look for a doctor, feeling a bit nervous because of his anger, but instead, she steadied her breath. Maybe trying to talk with him was a bad idea after all, but she was here, and right now that was all he had. Clearing her throat, she regained her composure. Maybe it's because I want to hear about you. Tell me what you've been up to. Misty tried. At that comment, Ash's eyes lit up like a firecracker, and at least for a brief moment, he forgot about the oddity of his situation. Or perhaps, it was the drugs and occasional conscious slips that allowed him to so easily forgive her for her evasiveness. He started to ramble, albeit slowly and painfully, about his adventures. Occasionally he made references to other leagues, regions, Pokémon, people he wouldn't/shouldn't know that were obscure and abnormal. Misty had to bite down hard on her inner cheek to avoid being mortified, reminding herself that this boy had been in a coma for 10 years. There was bound to be a screw loose somewhere. Ash had created a whole new world in his dreams while he was sleeping, but the more he talked, the more it became a world that Misty wished she could have been a part of. Where the good guys always won, and bad people lost, were dealt with, or goofballs. No one ever died, people were always happy, and solutions were always found. Slowly, as he talked about the Pokémon he should have known nothing about, Misty's face turned from terror into happiness, watching the light in his eyes while he spoke. At first she was ecstatic, that he was able to recall so many events, even if they weren't real. Then, happiness drifted, and worry took its place. If he thought all of these events were real, and he most definitely did, what was going to happen when they told him the truth? As nearly an hour ticked by, she was laughing when she was supposed to, but she didn't make any comments. She didn't want to influence the idea that these dreams were real, because they weren't, but she didn't want to damn them, either. He spent 10 years in his own Minda. What else could he have done other than create an intricate, detailed world? Even if it was a bit terrifying, she was sure it helped just to talk. He didn't even seem to mind that she had no impute. A knock came from the door, jarring their attention to the same old nurse from before, the one with the sweet disposition and laugh lines. "I'm sorry to cut your visit short, but I need to set up some appointments with Mr. Ketchum, run a few tests, and get a few signatures," she said in a sullen tone as she eyed Misty, who was collecting her purse from the floor beside Ash's bed. "But first, could I talk with you for a moment in the hallway, Ms. Waterflower?" she squeaked softly, catching both Ash and Misty's attention. The latter of which pursed her lips and shrugged her agreement as she tossed a quick goodbye to Ash, and followed the nurse into the hallway. "Please, call me Misty. You'll make me feel like my mother otherwise," Misty muttered as she cracked the door to Ash's room, leaving the beaming boy staring after her. When Misty finally turned to look at the nurse, the look of intense worry, mixed with frustration, caught her attention. Misty could reflect that composure. "We can't seem to get a hold of any family members, and his emergency contact is, well, deceased." Misty cocked her jaw at the nurse's words, knowing where this was going as the nurse continued. "The clerk at the front counter said that you were the one who brought him in 10 years ago, is this correct?" Misty nodded. "Well, this might be improper to ask." She shuffled some papers before presenting Misty with some of Ash's results, which made no sense to the gym leader. "I know you're a very busy woman, but would it be possible for you to stand in as a contact, at least until we can get a hold of his mother?" "Ah, there's the request," Misty thought bitterly as the nurse referenced to some important vitals on Ash's chart with her pen, and then flipped the page, to which Misty shook her head slightly. Misty wasn't sure what to say, so she looked at the nurse, whose sweet smile was hard to turn down. "His blood work, as well as the scans we took last night, show rapid improvement in 3 of his major cognitive processes. He's able to speak and comprehend at a much faster rate than other," she lowered her voice, "coma patients." "Why does that matter?" Misty asked quietly, pressing her hand against the form that had been handed to her. She glanced it over, and then shifted the notebook back into the nurse's old arms. She tucked it close to her chest and looked at Misty with pleading eyes. "Ms. Waterflower." "Misty, please," the nurse begged urgently. "The transition for someone in his situation can be devastating as is. To recover as quickly as he is can be twice as frightening. Usually a patient will take months to regain their ability to talk, but as you can tell, he seems to have no problem. Normally, we would have months to search for the relatives, but at this rate, he's already a candidate for physical therapy, and the psychologist suggests that having someone familiar around to smooth things over would be beneficial, and you seem to be close to him." Misty finished in her own thoughts with a loud sigh. Misty raised her hand to silence the nurse, having heard enough. She clicked her heel against the white tile while licking her lips, unable to believe the situation she was just put in. She looked up at the nurse, then back at the floor as she turned away to walk back to Ash's room and peek in at him. In his bed, he was using his fingers to tug gently on his bound wrists, and seemed to be humming something to himself, patiently waiting for the nurse's return. Misty kicked the wall beside his door, startling him, but not before she could walk back to the nurse and take the clipboard out of her hands. Had it been anyone else, any other person sitting in that room, Misty would have laughed. But damn her and her motherly instincts, what if no one else ever showed up? What if he was alone in the world? She wouldn't be able to sleep if she just left that up to fate, and so she clicked the pen and sighed. "All right, I'll do it," Misty grumbled, signing her name at the bottom of one of the forms before she could change her mind. Had any other nurse in this hospital asked her, she would have probably walked away. The nurse smiled gratefully at the redhead, who tried to appear nonchalant as the nurse verified Misty's information, which she could recite without thought. Essentially, Misty was asked to sign a release form beneath Ash's paperwork. It was the hospital's way to ensure that Ash could not be bullied into situations in the absence of his parents, but still needed care that he couldn't wait on, as well as allowing for Misty to be called in case of an accident. Since Ash was a minor before he woke up, until he was given proper psychiatric assessment, he was to be treated as such, which meant that he needed family, or someone he trusted, to witness all signatures that he was otherwise approached to make. To make him more comfortable, not that Misty had any control over what he could or could not do. It was perfectly legal since she was the first person on Ash's file at the hospital. Nevertheless, it wasn't very common because usually relatives came rushing back at the news of family waking up. Somehow, that sweet lady, Delia, that Misty met so many years ago, neglected to do so. You have no idea how much you just helped speed up the process. The nurse reassured Misty, pressing a soft hand onto her broad shoulder. Misty waved her off. Yet. Go get started. I need to call my sisters and let them know how much of a saint I am. Misty muttered sarcastically, sounding a bit peeved as she walked the hallway. Alas, that was probably the lack of proper sleep over the last 24 hours. Little did they know, that their entire conversation wasn't far enough away from Ash. He heard bits and pieces, and was trying to fit the pieces together in his mind, which seemed difficult considering the fog that haunted him. Speed up what process? He thought inwardly, but was not able to think critically because the nurse walked in with a beaming smile. All right, Mr. Ketchum, are you ready to get into the details of physical therapy? She asked, sounding overly chipper. Ash had to force himself to smile. Did he need physical therapy? Wiggling his fingers, he mentally thought, yes. As the nurse fumbled through the appropriate information, flipping through papers at a speed which Ash couldn't keep up with, Misty slipped quietly back into the room behind the nurse. She approached the foot of his bed with a rather frustrated look. Her posture screamed that she was angry, and Ash leered back at the paperwork to avoid her gaze. Not that she was looking at him. While the nurse spoke about therapy, she mentioned a psychologist that Ash needed to sign for, though he didn't understand why he needed that, either. The nurse said it was simply part of the recovery process. Are you right-handed or left? The nurse asked, pulling Ash from his stupor. Right, he muttered as the nurse reached over and unlatched his arm. She sat upright quickly, and fished a pen out of her pocket. Slipping said pen into Ash's fingers, which took an excruciating amount of effort to grasp, she placed the sheet next to him. Mustering all the strength he could manage, he pressed the ballpoint pen against the edge of the paper with a great deal of effort, and managed to sign his name not once, but twice. His arm felt like it had weights tied to it, and he was a little embarrassed by his horrible chicken scratch writing at the bottom of the page. He tried not to let on how he felt, but he was overly aware at how much larger his body was. How frail his body was. He could even touch the railing of the bed when he managed to wiggle his toe. He was taller, his voice was deeper as scratchy as ever, but not how he remembered it. Nothing was how he remembered it. Now are you okay with Misty here, witnessing as a family member for the time being? The nurse asked sweetly, forcing a small redness to Ash's face that went mostly unnoticed due to his gray features. Sure, I guess. He muttered awkwardly. The nurse flipped to the same release form that Misty had signed previously, which only made Ash feel more illiterate when he scribbled his name above her elegant signature. Strange, he remembered Misty having a rough and gawky signature. The nurse snatched the pen from his fingers, and then gently bound his hand again, much to his dislike. She smiled down at him. Now just wait here, and a doctor will visit shortly, all right? She said sweetly, sparing a short glance to Misty whose expression had not lifted from the stipulated frustration that was there. He wasn't sure what to say to ease her troubled mind. While he wasn't altogether, and he didn't have all the facts, he was absolutely sure that he had been asleep for a while. Even though he saw the dates on the papers, he couldn't remember the last time he looked at the date, so he had no idea if it was accurate or not. How silly was that? After sharing a brief glance with the gym leader, she let out a loud sigh. I'm going to go, and I'm going to have a shower. She expressed while approaching his curtains and tugging them closed. In the distance, he could see the sun setting. Wasn't it morning? He murmured, and Misty could only shake her head dutifully as she smiled at him. Shortly, she brushed her hand against his blankets and then gave him a curt, defeated head shake that worried him to no end. "Get some rest. I'll see you in the morning," she muttered oddly while walking out of his room, the distant tap of her shoes indicating that she had left for real. The excitement over, he looked over at the window again. She had only shut the sheer blinds, so he could still see some of the sky. Maybe he had slept the entire day away? How odd. He wanted to press his hand against his forehead, but under current circumstances, he could not. Instead, he shut his eyes, trying to align his thoughts. Where was he? Why did everyone seem so awkward with him? Where was his mom? And what happened to him? His eyes were too heavy to open, but he resolved that when he saw Misty next, he would ask her about this, but for now, he was simply exhausted. Locked away, Chapter 4. Nearly 2 weeks had passed since Ash woke up. He spent at least 2 hours a day in physical therapy, 2 hours getting check UPS, constantly having to check if all of his vitals and organs were still strong. On a good day, he would be poked with a needle only twice a day. He also had a CAT scan and an MRI to check for any brain damage, and probably because the hospital wanted to rack up a good doctor's bill, they sent him for X-rays. In the beginning he wasn't allowed to leave his room. Physical therapy would come to him and they would do routine, light exercises, mostly focusing on regaining the function of his legs and building muscle. Since Ash was no doctor, he had no idea how long it would take for such weakness to occur, but by now, he was guessing at most a year. What in the world happened to him to keep him out for that long? Unfortunately, no one would tell him. Not even the psychotherapist that visited Ash every evening just to talk. Even Misty, one of his best friends, seemed to dodge the question. Instead, she talked about safe subjects, and Ash was starting to find it very intolerable and frustrating, more so now that the drugs were induced less and less. His mind seemed to clear up, but the clearer it became, the foggier his memory was. It disturbed him, but he tried not to think too much about it. Right now, he was focused on getting better and healing so that he could visit his mom. Misty never specified which, but she said his mother was simply taking care of urgent matters, but sends her regards. He wasn't sure that was the truth, but Misty had no reason to lie to him. On good days, if he managed to get through physical therapy without passing out, he was allowed to go outside for a little while, so long as he had someone to monitor him. Typically, Misty was the one to push his wheelchair around, as he did not have enough strength in his legs to walk. Being outside made him feel human again, which was the second best feeling since being taken off the painkillers. While sometimes his everything hurt, he knew he was at least alive if he was in pain. Because his stomach was out of use for a while, he was told by the doctors that he would need to keep an IV in his arm, rather than actual food. He was only allowed applesauce and pudding and some soft fruit. At this rate, he was even starting to think Misty's cooking would be better than the soft food diet the hospital gave him. Ash was improving, getting a little better every day, but as he grew, so did his questions. Misty couldn't handle the questions, he could tell from the expression on her face. She would grow fidgety and awkward, and would excuse herself from the room for any given reason. Even his shrink would get numbly quiet when Ash would ask questions about himself, and talk about his adventures. It seemed like everyone thought he was crazy. Misty came less and less as the weeks came to a close, making an appearance at least once a day to check on him after physical therapy was over. Specifically when he was usually too tired to plague her with questions. They would then sit in an awkward silence. He wasn't allowed to watch television, read magazines, and the only thing he was given to busy himself were crossword puzzles and an old romance novel that Misty lent him. He heard the doctors in the hallway more clearly when they spoke with her, often when they believed that Ash wasn't awake. How they mentioned that Ash was getting stronger every day, and that they weren't sure how much longer they should put off the truth. The nurses begged the doctors to wait until they could reach Delia, his mother. Though, he questioned why that was becoming an issue. Because of Ash's improvement, he was able to get that stupid, uncomfortable, itchy catheter removed, and with the help of a nurse, was able to get out of bed and walk to the bathroom to do his business. In his case, that was like an award-winning movement. He could even lift his arms without becoming fatigued. Most recently, when morning came, the nurse provided him with green hospital scrubs to wear instead of an itchy gown, so the day was already looking up. Look at every situation with a glimmer of joy. Isn't that what his mom always said? Thinking about his mother, he turned over in his bed, and kicked his feet to the side, practicing raising his knees when the physical therapist was out. Honestly, he was obsessively bothered by the fact that his mother hadn't stopped in to visit yet. Sure, he didn't call very often, or visit much, but that didn't seem like a good reason to ignore Ash. For this reason, Ash needed to see someone, anyone that wouldn't treat him like he would shatter if they actually spoke to him about what happened. Ash knew something happened. Now if someone could tell him what it was, instead of treating him like he was crazy, he would be eternally grateful. He muttered under his breath. At one point, when Misty had excused herself to the washroom, he tried to use her phone to call his mother, but he couldn't even figure out how to turn on the slick black brick, let alone make a phone call. Instead, when she returned, he asked her to call, but his efforts were denied by her immediate departure thereafter. She dodged his requests, she ignored his questions, she treated him like he was crazy, and when she spoke to him, it was like he was a baby. By this point, he barely wanted her around if she was just going to bite her tongue at everything. But being alone didn't exactly sound appealing, either. Since taking her phone the first time, he repeatedly asked her every day, to the point that she started to deny bringing her phone because the battery was dead. The worst thing, however, was that he could see her own look of frustration. He wasn't the only one who was upset by the hospital, she was as well, she just didn't show it as much as he did. For that, he was grateful. If she wasn't allowed to talk about what was going on, he at least appreciated the thought that she was as frustrated as he was. Lucky for him, yesterday evening, he had been moved to the third floor, the physical therapy wing of the hospital, and had a room with a nice view of the outer gardens. More white walls, more blue curtains, but it was better than listening to screaming patients in the ICU at midnight, ripping him from a dead sleep. In celebration, Misty promised to bring lunch and got permission to bring him into the garden for an entire hour. He was friggin' ecstatic. Be positive about the little things, he reiterated to himself continuously as he practiced lifting the weights next to his bed to pass the time. Down the hall, he knew that Misty had arrived, because of the heated discussion with his physical therapy team and shrink that echoed the hallway. Ash pursed his lips. It was the third time that week that Misty had gotten into a spat with the older gentleman, but from what he could recall, it was probably about the same thing as 2 days ago. Come clean and tell him because I can't handle this anymore. She had screamed, her shrill voice bellowing through the ICU and silencing even the most traumatized patients. The fight started after Ash decided he didn't want to talk with the therapist anymore. The therapist would make comments about his memories being dreams, and since that was clearly impossible, Ash simply stopped talking, which resulted in staring contests between the young adult and the old man. Misty started fighting with him after Ash's last late afternoon session, in which the therapist tried to push whatever news onto Misty, to which she exploded. Ash laughed at that. He could only imagine the man's face at her rise in anger. Misty could be fierce and intimidating, if not by her appearance anymore, then by her voice alone. Ash was familiar with her rage, having it upon himself many times, only when he tried to recall specific events, he found it more and more difficult to do so. Ending her spat with the therapist, Misty muttered as she turned the corner into his room and stumbled upon something very peculiar. Ash, who had been entirely engrossed in his own thoughts only a few moments ago, was standing on his own. He wore green hospital scrubs and a robe while attempting to walk from his bed to the window. Even though he seemed to brood on most occasions the last week, his mesmerized gaze of outside never faded. The cascading light that danced over the inner garden, the large water fountain that had been cleaned yesterday, and the gentle rays of the warm sun. She wondered for a brief moment if his body knew the truth far before his mind did. That he had been stuck in a tiny room for 10 years, sleeping, longing to be outside. His skin had lost the dark tan that he had as a child, but he was no longer pasty, no longer transparent. Color radiated in his cheeks as he pulled the curtain aside to peek into the garden. Fresh air was so close, he could almost open the window and tumble out, thoughtless of the results. Excited to breathe in anything other than the smell of sterile hospital and latex. Mesmerized herself, Misty paused at the door. His shoulders, which had been lowered in defeat at the start, were raised like a champion's as his head bobbed to each pygmy that flew by. He nodded to other patients who tottered around in their wheelchairs around the garden. Whether he knew it or not, he looked like a little kid seeing the world for the first time. So, she thought that he must know, at some unconscious level, what happened to him. She cleared her throat, effectively eliminating his grin. Surprised, Ash nearly tumbled. Panicked and praying that it wasn't a nurse, because the last time a nurse caught him standing on his own, he was scolded for half an hour. Misty rushed to his side to snatch him before he fell. Arms outstretched and having tossed her purse and basket to the side in preparation to catch him a butt, he managed to steady himself on his own by gripping the windowsill. "I thought you were yelling at that shrink," he grumbled, looking down at her. She had fallen into a lunged position in her belief that he would fall, and had to smack her lips awkwardly before standing upright. Still wide-eyed, she replied while dusting off her shirt, "I was, but now I'm not. I didn't expect to see you standing." Offering only a grin in reply, he walked, albeit wobbly, from the window back to his bed, where he plopped down and threw his arms up as if screaming success, garnering a well-earned scowl from the redhead. "You could really hurt yourself doing that," she scolded, but he simply adjusted his position on the bed and shrugged. "If I don't practice, I won't get better," he retorted matter-of-fact with a raised eyebrow. He was clearly breathless, just from that short jot, but he tried not to show it. Misty gnawed on her cheek, wanting to persuade more that he was rushing the process, but instead, a thick blanket of silence slipped between the two of them. Previously, occasions of silence were met with thousands of Ash's questions, but as he thought he wouldn't get an answer, his championed shoulders drooped down in a sad way. Nevertheless, he forced himself to smile. There it was again, that look. From his perch on the hospital bed, he could see the ticking of her brain as she watched him, weighing the consequences of a decision that she had little control over. She looked frustrated, yet thoughtful, and Ash was sure if he had that many thoughts in his head, he would surely have a headache. She stood with her thumb and index finger under her chin, and Ash could see that her hair was tied back with the help of bobby pins and a clip. 2 pieces of red hair fell to frame her face, and once again, he thought that it made her look older. Her white skirt and light blue button-up top and slip-on shoes only added to the age. He cracked an earnest smile. "You dress a lot girlier now than you used to," he commented. His words had a kick to them, yanking her out of her own mind and back into reality as she looked at him breathless. Misty had forgotten how she was dressed, and completely disregarded the fact that she had tied her hair back in what she would call the mother updo until he mentioned it. Unadulterated irritation formed in the appearance of a snarl on her face. Unfortunately, Misty paused, walking to the basket she discarded a few minutes ago. "When my sisters dropped clothes off for me, they dropped off their hand-me-downs. Apparently, I don't have a professional wardrobe." Misty groaned while rubbing her temples. Over the last week or so, she had grown accustomed to talking about her sisters with Ash. That was one of the few topics that she could talk to him about without any awkwardness or worry about spilling the truth. He watched her with a grin of amusement, twisting his fingers in the sheets below. He was about to speak when she set the basket down beside him on the foot of the bed. "We still on for that picnic?" she asked while watching the light pour into his eyes. All of his facial features beamed at the reminder of their planned activity, and he was stoked. Giggling, Misty shook her head as she wheeled out his wheelchair from the corner of the room, and the light faded from his eyes, replaced with a stern pout. "I can walk," he tried, but Misty ended that before it started with a firm head shake. "No, no, you cannot. You know the hospital would wring my neck if I let you leave this room without a wheelchair." She let out a sigh, but the sudden awareness that he would need to be pushed around in a wheelchair again made him weary. "Look, I can just leave you the basket if you want to have a nurse take you later instead." Her face scrunched up as she talked, but at the rejection, Ash chimed in quickly. "No, we can go. Anything to get out of this room." He looked up at her with beady, brown eyes and knit his brows together. "I just hate relying on people to push me around." "Well, you're unfortunately stuck with me until you feel better." Her words stung slightly, her callous tone reminding him once again that Misty was different in every way he could possibly remember. Even the way she carried herself was different. Surely there were a plethora of reasons, but he could never fathom that it was because Ash was still a stranger to her. He watched as she wedged the wheelchair to the side of his bed and put the brakes on. "Do you need help?" He was up before she could finish, and had fallen happily into the seat of the uncomfortable locomotive. She raised an eyebrow and chuckled. At least her laugh was the same, he thought anxiously. "Did you bring your phone today?" he tried. Misty replied by plopping a wicker basket neatly onto his lap. XOX. The outer garden of the Viridian City Hospital was massive. Trails leading almost a mile around the facility, though trees, flowers, and hills. At the back of the garden, the vast forest, which was fenced off as a well-maintained portion of the Viridian Forest, was often used in helping to relax patients. The front of the garden was a mass of flowers surrounding a multitude of trimmed shrub and the large water fountain. Surrounded by several benches, this is where most people spent their time, the inner garden. Misty, however, wanted to show Ash something a little different, something that might jar his memory. Demonstrating her amazing strength, she pushed Ash to the top of the northwest hill, the tallest hill in the garden at the start of the gated portion of the forest. A concrete bench sat at the top, but few ever bothered to travel there unless it was a jogging nurse or doctor on their free time. Most patients couldn't make it up the excruciating incline. Misty, a professional swimmer, could barely make it up the hill with an embarrassed, yet enthusiastic Ash. If she wasn't pushing the patient, she was sure the hill would be cake, but the extra weight was an extreme exercise routine all on its own. She told herself that at least the way down would be easier. Finally reaching the top, she rolled him beside the bench so that he wouldn't fall down and then let out a loud, weary sigh and collapsed on top of the bench facing upward at the sky. He whistled at her with an amused expression and gave her a thumbs up. "Today, I learned that the Hulk is secretly hiding in the body of a ginger female." Obviously not catching on to the degrading sarcasm laced in his voice after having been pushed up a hill, she pumped her fist in victory. Misty chuckled as she sat up, finally catching his embarrassed gaze and twisted fingers, and shook her head. "It's worth the view. I promise," she reiterated, watching most of the humiliation exit his features as she took the basket from his fingers and pulled out a blue blanket that she spread out over the concrete bench. "Don't picnics usually go on the ground?" He half muttered the question, shooting Misty a shy glance. She huffed in response, busy with straightening the blanket. "I know you're stronger than you were 2 weeks ago, but I'm not sure you could pull yourself off the ground without help, and I'm not much help." It took a moment for her words to sink in, but when they did, he shifted uncomfortably. Since she took his hand that day 2 weeks ago, she never touched him. Not that he could remember much physical contact with the gym leader in the first place, it just seemed like she intentionally tried to avoid it more now, or at least it felt like that way. "You just pushed dead weight up a slope like this," he gestured with his forearm to make the slope, causing her to laugh. "I think if I fell down, the last thing I would have to worry about is getting up." He paused to look at the grassy hill that led back down to the main encampment of the garden. "Besides, if I got stuck, I could just roll down." "Yeah, and put yourself into another." Luckily, she caught herself, and slapped her hand over her mouth. He didn't seem to notice, however, occupied instead by the view she had mentioned before. She was right, it was well worth the wait. He saw the entire hospital, even his room window, from the hill. But beyond that, he saw the entire city, or at least most of it. A mixture of smells of wild flowers and cotton penetrated his nostrils, and he closed his eyes. Taking in the scent, the wind whipped across his face and he eased up. His chest rose and fell as he inhaled deeply. No matter how much he tried to remember, the last time he felt this way was when he was a child. The rush of the open air, the smell of the flowers, the heat on his flesh from the sun. "I miss this," he uttered breathlessly, much to Misty's amazement. When his eyes opened, he was grinning at her as he went to stand up on his own. Misty offered her hand to help, but he was surprisingly able to stand without the assistance. She was impressed. Most people took weeks to get to this point. After working the feeling back into his toes the first week, he was determined to walk all on his own by the end of the month. Yes, he was sore. Yes, he was always tired, but more importantly, he was stronger. He slipped onto the concrete bench and let out a sigh of relief. Misty didn't miss a beat to start unloading the basket. The nurse said so long as I didn't bring anything super heavy you could have something other than soft foods, so I brought a sandwich, and soft food. Just in case she held out the neatly wrapped, thin bread sandwich, that had no cheese, no meat, and was actually just bread. Mist. He mumbled, shifting the sandwich in his lap. "This is just bread." "Yeah, they said that anything else might be too rough on your stomach. But, you know, you could pretend there's delicious cheese and meat, and vegetables on there," she murmured while coughing gently. He raised his eyebrows at her. "It's the thought that counts," he muttered gratefully while unwrapping the bread. The waft of fresh bread hit all of his senses, and his stomach growled tremendously. How long had it been since he ate real food? It felt like forever. He could hardly remember the last time anything smelled so good. He broke the bread as Misty revealed 2 juice boxes, a bottle of water, and her own vegetable sandwich. "The nurse suggested bringing something homemade, but I'm not the best cook," she grimaced while crossing one knee over the other, taking in the serene picture before her. "I know," he answered quickly, tasting the delicious kick of baked perfection. His eyes lit up and he had to remind himself that he was only allowed small portions. His taste buds were alive with the vibrant aftertaste of cedar wood. This far surpassed the soft, tasteless food from the hospital. He hadn't noticed right away, but she grew visibly uncomfortable at his comment. He knew, he kept saying. He knew that she was the gym leader before anyone told him. He knew that she trained water Pokémon. He knew that she had 3 sisters before she told him, that she hated bug Pokémon, and a multitude of other things that he simply couldn't have known. Though, when Misty brought it up to the therapist, he continuously told her that it was subconscious recognition. Misty couldn't argue, she might have mentioned those things during her visits. When the silence blanketed over them, he watched her carefully with an overbearing sadness. The way her eyes drew to the ground, how her hair fell limp in its bun, and her lack of words were so unlike herself as usual. Having been starving only moments ago, and excited for lunch all day, he suddenly felt quite repulsed and settled for looking into the distance apathetically. The mute nature wasn't lost on Misty, but she didn't have a lot to say. Nothing that wasn't advised against, as she wasn't allowed to talk about Pokémon, or herself, or anything that would imply the shift in time. She could talk about her sisters again, but that didn't do much. And he had long since stopped telling her about his adventures for whatever reason. Everything she wanted to talk about surfaced from the single question, "What was the last thing you really remember?" Instead, she opted to pluck her peppers out of her sandwich, and allow frustration to take over again. She wasn't anything to Ash, so why had she agreed to help him in the first place? Muttering endlessly about whatever was on her mind, Ash chuckled, catching her attention. "What's so funny?" she questioned, ending the silence between them. You might look like a lady now, but you don't eat like a lady. He replied instantly, covering his mouth as he laughed and observed the pile of peppers she scooped off into the discarded wrapper. Her mouth twitched as a vein pulsed on her forehead. A tint of red rose to her cheeks, and upon seeing the oh-so-familiar reaction, he started to laugh harder. For a moment, it felt normal. Like they were old friends, or at least acquaintances. Misty was already accustomed to being around him, at least sleeping him, so it was easier. But Ash, he claimed to have already known her for years. She was a part of his dreamland, and she wasn't entirely sure how she felt about that. A part of her was scared, believing Ash was crazy, yet, another part of her believed it was a defense mechanism. Catching her emotion, his laughter died down and was replaced by a wave of depression, followed by an exasperated sigh. Just get through this visit, she thought to herself, inhaling deeply. Then she could go back to her hotel room, read a few of her textbooks, and pretend like this never happened. Perhaps she could have succeeded had she not looked over at the sullen boy. His shoulders leaned forward, his lips turned downward in a permanent frown, and his eyes, oh his eyes, were like open gates into his own personal torment and hell. Yes, his body knew something was wrong, but his mind was. She couldn't take it anymore. Do you want to talk about it? What you're going through? She managed, only to watch his depression fade into irritation quickly. What I'm going through, he scoffed. I don't even know what exactly I'm going through. Ash licked his lips gently, gathering his thoughts. They all seemed so scattered, so confusing, but he felt like sharing none of them with Misty. At least, not this Misty. Clucking her tongue awkwardly, she placed her sandwich into the basket, no longer hungry. Have you thought about it at all? She inquired weakly. Of course. Every day, he snapped, even though he didn't mean to be so irritable. Misty was different, but at least she was around. Misty wasn't entirely sure what to follow with, so she pursed her lips. I know we're not close, she thought, but neglected to add it in favor of his reality. But you can talk to me. Talk to you, he objected harshly, whipping his head around to look at her. She could finally see that his cheeks were no longer sunken in, replaced instead by a strong chin and fleshy cheeks. I've tried. You don't answer any of my questions, and when you do, they're so vague you might as well have not answered at all. He grumbled, watching her sea green eyes for any indication of dishonesty. There wasn't any. I'm not supposed to tell you anything. Her eyes tore away from his, looking instead at the pumping water fountain at the bottom of the hill. I'm trying, she mused, crossing her arms over her chest. Ash lost it at that. Yeah, but why? You only show up after physical therapy when I'm too exhausted to ask you anything. You usually only stay for 10 minutes at a time to tell me about your sisters, and only your sister Saw, which you hate talking about, and then you treat me like I'm going to break if the truth sucks. He wasn't shouting, his voice didn't have the power behind it right now. Instead, his tone reflected desperation, confusion. Everything he said was true. Misty felt guilty, but she had to choke back her answers, too. It wasn't like this was easy for her, as she hardly knew Ash, and yet here she was, sympathetic to his needs with no other reason behind them other than the guilt that she felt slightly responsible for his accident 10 years ago. She ran a trembling hand through her hair, messing up the pins as some fell lopsidedly to the side of her head. I'm not supposed to. To what? Treat me like a human? Talk to me without looking at the clock 6 times? If I'm crazy, just let me know. I mean, I can hear you fighting with my therapist, Misty. His words flattened out at the end, having ran out of breath. If it's that big of a deal to visit, then you don't have to, he murmured, uneasily folding his arms. It was so strange to say this to the girl beside him. There was a time when he knew he didn't have to. Misty would have been scolding him for being so reckless, but she would have been the first person to tell him what was going on, as well. Feeling accused, she sighed in defeat. The hospital asked me to stay. If he thought that the truth would make him feel better, he was so very wrong. The sound of her confession hit him like a hammer to the chest, and he shook his head, muttering great under his breath. He lurched forward, letting his elbows rest on his knees, and his hands cradle his head. Who even was this Misty? It wasn't his Misty, he knew that for sure. The only problem? He could barely remember his Misty. His defeated reaction egged her on. Well, what did you want to hear? She half yelled, startling him. This was the first time she raised her voice at him, but he gazed up at her, face scrunched. How about what's going on with me? Why am I in Viridian City? Why does it feel like memories are slipping away by the handfuls and I have to visit a therapist for 3 hours every day who forces me to talk about the same thing every day, and yet tells me nothing? Halfway through his aggressive tone turned into one of intense fear, wrapped with a shudder. Where's my mom? He added meekly, looking at the ground below his feet. Unsure of what to do, she reached out her hand to stroke his back, but he immediately shrugged her hand off. Don't touch me, he countered. Letting her hand fall limp between them, she swallowed and cast her eyes to her feet while he pressed his hand against his forehead. I'm not crazy, okay? I don't need to be babied. Ash, you aren't crazy. Misty reassured him, making a decision. You're just remembering things wrong, she tried, sucking in as much air as she possibly could. Her heart raced behind her chest and she let her shoulders fall. She wished for a moment she had a doctor here to bail her out, to have an excuse to leave in some way, but she couldn't do that. He needed to know whether it was right for him or not. I'm not remembering things correctly, he echoed, looking alarmed at her. Be honest. Do you know me, like really know me? He asked, sitting up with a pained expression. Misty fidgeted, unsure of how to answer that question. No, she didn't. She had no idea who he was until after she brought him to the hospital, and she most definitely didn't share all of the memories that he brought up. It took her a moment, but she motioned her head side to side. If Ash had blinked, he would have missed it. A worried expression laced over her pale features, to which Ash sighed. Because I know you. He replied confidently, looking directly at her. His gaze startled her, so she shook her head once more, this time more self-assured. No, Ash, you think you know me. You dreamed me up probably because I was the... Ash shook his head, smiling in disbelief. No, he cut her off. You're a gym leader, you love water Pokémon, you dream of going to Kalos someday. You hate peppers and carrots and bugs terrify you. That's not exactly. You own a Gyarados that knows flamethrower. He added, but Misty shrugged. These weren't exactly tiebreakers, and quite frankly, he was scaring her. Catching her fear, he sighed, frustrated. Your parents walked out on you when you were 6. Your older sisters' names are Daisy, Lily, and Violet. You're the youngest. They used to be the gym leaders, but after they made you feel like a second-rate sister your entire life, you walked out telling them that you wouldn't return until you became a water Pokémon master. You were terrified of Gyarados since you were a baby because you had accidentally crawled into one's mouth. He paused for air, her eyes returning to his chocolate-colored ones. Her mouth fell ajar in disbelief. Your favorite Pokémon is Goldeen, Seduc irritates you, you're a compulsive maniac about romance, your favorite color is yellow and I know that the only reason your hair is a darker shade of red, she touched her hair at his comments, he continued, is because it's naturally orange and you hate being called Carrot Top. He gulped at the end of his rant, readying himself for the reaction that would knock him onto his ass, but it never came. She gawked at him instead, the fear replaced with amazement. Am I wrong? He asked suddenly. Once again, Misty could only reply with a head shake. She was stunned from his knowledge. Regardless of what the doctors said, it seemed like too much information for only his subconscious to hang on to. Initially, she, though stalker, but he was in a coma for 10 years, so that was out of the question. Since he awoke, he hadn't been allowed the use of computers, and no one in Viridian City knew her well enough to know her that well. After she didn't reply, he took it as a sign of rejection, so he scoffed and rubbed his eyes in disbelief. For a moment, Misty thought that he would cry, but he never did. "Listen, I'm sorry for bothering you so much." He sighed, and looked at his wheelchair. "Can you just do my one last favor and take me back to my room, or just to the doors and the nurse can take me the rest of the way?" he asked shamefully. She rocketed to her feet and extended her arms out at her sides for emphasis. "Do you remember the last thing that happened to you?" Ash gazed up at her, eyes bloodshot. He blinked a few times, drawing a blank. Of course he knew. He told her the last thing that he remembered. He was in Kalos, he just won his last gym badge. He knit his eyebrows as she exhaled. "Because I do." He shook his head slightly, unaware of what she meant as she continued. "On July 22nd, I fished you out of a river bank on Route 1 outside of Pallet Town. You were cradling a nearly exhaust Pikachu, and I slapped you for your negligence. After that, you stole my bike." Drawing air into her lungs to finish before he could speak, she puffed up her chest. "Almost an hour after I fished you out, I made my way towards Viridian City to find you and get my bike back. That's when I found you. Collapsed in the middle of the road, barely breathing, hunching over your Pikachu with shocks of electricity still rising from your body." Now, it was Ash's turn to struggle. He couldn't recall the memory. Well, he could recall a bit of it, but it mostly seemed like a vague, distant past, but it seemed so accurate. The waver in her voice almost crushed him. "I visit you, and I stay here because I'm the one that brought you here, Ash. I carried you the last 2 miles to Viridian City on my back. I brought you to this hospital and you've been here since then." She exhaled, heartbreaking at his expression. "That's the last thing that happened to you. There wasn't a grand adventure, you've never been anywhere other than Kanto." As she sputtered the truth, tears formed in the corners of her eyes, sorry that she had to be the one to tell him this. For a long moment, they didn't break eye contact, but they didn't speak, either. Ash's body shook as he inhaled deep, and exhaled, trying to wrap his head around her words. Ash knew that he wasn't lying about his dreams. They were real. At least to him, but Misty, her story seemed so much more believable than a 10-year-old traveling 6 regions without aging, without worry of shelter or food or school. He let out a sigh he didn't know he was holding in, and looked down. How long ago was that?" he managed breathlessly. 10 years. She commented. Seconds after the words fell from her mouth, Ash's whole body froze, and he felt his mind spiraling away from him. He shuddered, telling himself it couldn't be true. It couldn't be, but it made perfect sense. His eyes were wide to the point that they could have fallen out, and he shook his head. Suddenly, he lurched backwards, standing quickly. Too quickly. Misty tried to calm him, but he was walking away from her, towards the forest lining. "I don't believe that. What kind of game are you playing?" he screamed in denial. His legs wobbled beneath him, but adrenaline pumped through his veins, giving him strength he hadn't before. Sheer determination fueled his body. "You're going to fall. Ash, stop!" she screamed, alerting a few nurses who were in the garden. Having a hard time following after him in the pencil skirt her sisters brought her, she tried to jog, only catching up with him the moment his legs buckled. Misty hadn't been fast enough. She couldn't catch him before he fell, but she was knelt down beside him only seconds after. He rolled over onto his back and looked up at her, writhing in pain from his stupid sprint, and in a few other places thanks to his rough landing. He didn't know what to say as she scooped his head into her lap and called after anyone available. Her voice traveled far, but Ash could feel the stinging salt at the corner of his eyes, and he covered his face with his forearm while she glanced over him in a panic to make sure nothing major was bleeding or broken. What did he just hear? How could he believe this? He bit the inside of his cheek. How in the world was he asleep for 10 years and never noticed? Mew, how dense was he? 6 regions and he was still 10? How in the world did he ever think that was normal? He shuddered violently as her soft hands smoothed through his hair. He could hear the footfalls of hospital staff running up the hill when he tucked his eyes into the crook of his elbow and started to weep. I was there. In Kalos. He mumbled. Ash, that's impossible. You've been here. She tried stroking his hair in comfort, but he looked up at her with an intense glare. You're lying, he shouted, trying to sit up, only to find that he couldn't. Fuck falling. How do I know this isn't the fake world, he whined, trying to control his tears, but they spilled out of him like rivers. Misty, too, had shed a few tears, but kept them at bay so that at least one of them wouldn't be blubbering to the help. No, she couldn't relate to the idea that he missed half of his life, but she could relate to the pain. So when he finally mustered enough strength to sit up, she snagged him quickly, wrapping both arms up and around his back, pulling him into a warm, much-needed, embrace. I wouldn't lie to you. Not about this. She said calmly, wrapping her hand up around the back of his neck, pressing his face to rest against her shoulder, where she whispered into his ear. I am so sorry this happened to you. But it will be okay, Ash. I promise. She whined into his collar until finally, his tears exploded and he wrapped his arms around her back, sobbing violently into her shoulder. She brushed her hand through his hair, trying to get him to calm down, but nothing eased his pain. Nothing but time would. Locked away, Chapter 5. To say that he handled the news rough was an understatement. Ash handled it grievously. It took nearly 30 minutes to get him back to his room, and once there, he fell into a depressed state for a few hours. How could this happen to him? Worse yet, Ash's therapist demanded that security put a temporary restriction on this Misty's visiting permissions for 1 week. Apparently, no one thought that Ash was ready for the news. Perhaps he was not, but he wanted to know. No matter how horrible the truth was, wasn't that what he had told Misty? However, no part of Ash was prepared for that. 10 years. His whole life, every journey, every friend, everything. It was all a dream. He exhaled and rolled over, tugging at his stiff hospital sheet. How in the world did this happen to him? Couldn't they have done something to wake him up sooner? Vaguely, he recalled the incident when Pikachu electrocuted him. He had just taken Misty's bike and was in a rush to get to the nearest Pokémon Center, and away from angry sparrows. That was the start of his journey. His first day out. Ash was comatose since his 10th birthday. He flipped back over onto his back, staring up at the dark ceiling. Ash couldn't believe it. His door was cracked, so that the light of the hallway wouldn't disturb his sleep. Hospitals never shut down, even at midnight. Apparently, he did. Apparently he shut down for 10 years. Brock, May, Max, Dawn, Celine, Iris, Clement, Bonnie, and Serena. Team Rocket. Everyone else, they couldn't all be a figment of his imagination, could they? How would someone even describe that? How could he make all of that stuff up? Sure, he guessed he should have noticed that he traveled through 6 leagues at the age of 10, but time never seemed to be an issue in his world. It didn't matter. Maybe that should have been his first clue, but when it never really existed, how was he supposed to know the difference? Being told the truth about his situation did nothing to solve his problem. Now, he only had more questions, but this time, they were, oh Mew. He curled up on his bed, looking towards the crack in the window. How much of his life was real? None of it, said the therapist when they got him back into the hospital after Misty's confession. None of it. Nothing that happened after that incident Misty described to him was real. Oddly enough, that didn't feel right. None of this felt right. To make matters worse, Misty was escorted off the premise of the hospital for threatening the therapist. What over? He had no idea. But it resulted in her visitation suspension. His stomach ached. Earlier that day, he wanted nothing more than to be left alone, to see Misty the way she was or not at all, but now, he would have just accepted her the way she is. The idea that she wouldn't be allowed back for an entire week terrified him. What if she didn't come back at all? Technically, she really didn't know him. Not really. She had no reason to help him anymore, especially now that he knew the truth. Ash's heart ached at the thought. To top it off, they couldn't reach his mother, either. And Pikachu? Heaven knew where the mouse Pokémon was, or if it would even remember Ash as anything more than the bad trainer that he was when he first started his journey. It pained him to imagine that he and Pikachu never really bonded, that it was all, just, nothing. Ash's nostrils flared, and he curled his pillow over his head. Listening beyond his room, he could hear the night shift nurses gossiping to one another, and the distant sound of a television. He swore that if he hadn't fallen earlier and possibly damaged his tailbone and hip from his impoverished landing, he would have stumbled out of his room, and demanded to watch the news, or really, anything that would verify that Misty wasn't lying to him. Or the nurses. Or the doctors. Or the therapist. That he hadn't been asleep for 10 years. Now that the skitty was out of the bag, the therapist vouched for her, but then quickly tried to justify not telling Ash because it wasn't for Ash's best interests. No, he thought, it wasn't for their best interests. They didn't want to deal with him. Not without his mother. What, did they think he would break? Ash grimaced lightly. He just might, he couldn't lie. He had never felt this way before. The sudden head rush, adrenaline, shaking anger, and depression that simply did not exist in his dream world. Not even when he lost a battle in his own mind had he felt like this. He groaned pitifully. Man, he was locked in his own mind for 10 years and he still never made himself the champion. What kind of low blow was that to his self-esteem? He pinched the bridge of his nose, and exhaled. What was he supposed to do now? Restart? How could anyone expect him to restart? He had already obtained so much, yet, nothing at all. Where was he supposed to go from here? He touched his head with his forearm and inhaled sharp, taking in the clean scent of the hospital. The darkness wrapped around his eyes, teasing him. In the shadows cast on the ceiling from the moon, he could see the shapes of everything left behind. His friends, his family, his life. Tears pooled at the corners of his eyes and he sniffled, knowing how pathetic he must have looked. He fell asleep with these thoughts in his head. Falling further and faster into a depression. Ash withdrew himself from this new, darker world. He didn't want to be a part of it. Not like this, not if it meant that everything he knew was simply, gone. XOX. By the third morning of her suspension, Misty was tired of waiting for a call from the hospital. She tapped her neatly manicured fingers against the wrist of the opposite arm. Earlier, she had all but lost her patience with Ash's therapist and with this whole situation. How dare he accuse Misty of creating a roadblock for Ash? He was already in one. How was he supposed to get better if he didn't know what he was recovering from? Just telling him you can do it, over and over wasn't going to increase motivation, and he looked so sad. Any good therapist should have seen the sadness in Ash's eyes, so Misty didn't regret her decision to tell him. Sure, Ash was handling it poorly right now, but he would get better. Right? He just needed time. Soaking in the sun behind her curtains, she argued that she told Ash the truth of his accident for his sake. Or was it to appease her own guilt every time he looked at her? Sure, it wasn't the best situation to be in, but it was all that he had. The truth, no matter how bad, wasn't that what he said? Sitting up, the comforter fell to her waist and she pinched the bridge of her nose with an audible sigh escaping her lips. The therapist told her to go home after their spat. Since the truth was out, the hospital didn't need her around anymore. Ash would be in full control of his treatment and handling. However, when the therapist started making some accusations, it took every bone in her body to deter from hitting the man. He was lucky he got away with just a scolding, because if security hadn't thrown her out, she would have probably. She exhaled, thumbing the blue and white comforter sprawled out over her legs. She would have probably lost her temper. So easy to rise to the challenge. Sometimes, she forgot her place. Sometimes she went a little overboard. But how dare that shrink insinuate that she, Misty Waterflower, was after Ash's assets? He didn't even own anything. Groaning, she rubbed her temples. She hadn't slept at all since the confession 3 days ago. Apart from her head already aching from lack of sleep, she had a migraine forming from the impromptu intake of alcohol from the night prior. Possibly not her best course of action, but all she could see after leaving the hospital was his brown, tear-soaked eyes staring up at her. She cared too much, that was Misty's curse. She couldn't be the bitch she tried to present herself as. No, she would always have that tiny conscience screaming at her. Mew, it almost ripped her heart out the way he looked at her, and she was the reason it happened. How was she supposed to know he would react so horribly to the news? He seemed perfectly fine just working day by day to get better. Now he knew why he had to get better, that was something, right? Misty threw herself backwards on the bed. She needed to go home, and yet she couldn't pull herself out of the hotel room, to the Viridian City train station for the 3-hour trip to Cerulean City. Before, she felt responsible for him, since no one else had come back to claim him. Now, she felt guilty. This was the exact reason she didn't want to be the one to tell him about his situation. That look. Oh man, she knew she messed up by telling him the second it happened. Those chocolate brown eyes begging her for a different answer right before he exploded. She knew it. Groaning, she rolled over, wrapping the blankets around her body, messing them up more. Her phone was somewhere on the ground. She had thrown it in frustration after last night's ordeals. Patting around momentarily, the black rectangular object had fallen beneath the nightstand, scooping it up. She whipped her hair back, and then tapped the screen alive. At only 10% battery, she leaned over to plug the phone in with an irritated expression. Last night, since she couldn't leave the damn city, she had spent some time playing detective. Mostly trying to find Delia Ketchum. Since Misty had effectively managed to ruin Ash's recovery, state of mind, and all hope of reality, she thought that she could at least do this. Her last listed address was Road 467, Pallet Town. Her last available phone number was the one Misty had listed, but after that, nothing. Misty even thought about calling the police to put in a missing persons report, but how would she go about explaining that? Hi, I'm looking for this grown adult's mother, who may or may not be alive, but you know, just pulled the plug on her son and skipped town. The cops would laugh at her. Simply not showing up to the hospital was not grounds enough to make a case, and Misty didn't have the money to hire a private detective. Quite possibly, Delia didn't want to be found. Misty couldn't imagine why, so she thought that the news must not have reached the woman. Wherever she was, she must not have known that Ash woke up. That was the only way Misty justified the older woman's absence. Misty thumbed through her messages and emails quickly while anxiously gnawing on her nails. Dark black rings hung under her eyes, and she was in the same blue tank top from 2 weeks ago, in dire need of a wardrobe upgrade, but her mind was elsewhere. The league sent her a few emails regarding her temporary hiatus from the gym, mostly asking when she would be back, and if she would be available to judge a contest being held in Pewter City. She rolled her eyes. No, she was on vacation, damn it. Her sisters were perfectly fine at the gym. Daisy messaged her once. So, did Sleeping Beauty ever wake up? Misty rolled her eyes at her sister's excessive use of the word like even in text messages. She didn't bother to reply. Instead, she clicked back over to her internet search, and with a clear mind, she typed Delia's name into the search engine and pressed enter. The same as last night, aside from a few articles from Ash's initial accident, a few short stories and interviews from 3 years ago, she mostly dropped off the face of the earth. Which couldn't be possible. She was around here somewhere. She was at the hospital on Ash's 20th birthday to have his life support ended, so unless she ran off and... Oh no. Alarms rang in Misty's head and she snapped forward once again and retyped the entry, Delia Ketchum, obituary. Only, before the screen had finished loading, the hospital rang her. A bit confused and distracted, she swiped to answer and pressed the phone against her ear. Hello? Misty echoed, to which a nurse responded quietly. Her gaze fell to the floor as she listened, and then after inhaling quickly, she licked her lips. I'll be right there. Misty murmured, ending the call and throwing the blankets off of her body as she sprang from the bed. XOX. Ash only slept, and he wouldn't eat. He wouldn't speak, couldn't think. He didn't respond to nurse or doctor visits, and he wouldn't participate in either form of therapy. No, he had broken down, curled up in a ball on his bed. It was on the 3rd day of his depression that the nurses were hooking him back up to N4 drip and sedatives. The doctors had decided that he was not mentally capable of moving past such turmoil like so many coma patients, so they were trying to prevent his body from shutting down without a will to live. Ash was okay with that. What was there to live for? Obviously nothing he could remember. Nothing made sense in this world, and quite possibly, he didn't believe it was the real world. No, he was sick, sleeping somewhere in Kalos. That must have been it. That was his plan, to return to where he was. To leave this fake world. At least, that was the design, until the flash of unadulterated rage in the form of red hair yanked him, quite literally, out of his depression. What the hell are you doing? She yelled, her voice booming down the hallways. Ash stared up at her with wide eyes as she wrapped her fingers around the collar of his hospital gown and pulled him into a sitting position where her fiery green eyes bore holes into his skulls. Terrifying. More so than he could ever remember. How did you get in here? Ash squeaked, having not seen her enter. Of course, he hadn't seen anyone, not really. One glance at the door answered his question. That same old, happy-faced nurse from the first day smiled weakly at him. You said you could handle it. She yelped, and then dropped him. He slouched forward, feeling the 4 in his arm tug uncomfortably. The truth sucks, so your solution is to just fucking die. She paced the room angrily around him, wearing the same boots as the first day, recreating the same taps that haunted his first moments of consciousness. Ash started, but wasn't entirely sure what to say. Do you know what happens when you die? You don't wake back up. You don't get to visit a dreamland of wonderful adventures. You die. She muttered dangerously close to his face. Her rage was not lost on the older boy. He could feel his chest tighten nervously, and he swallowed, words stuck in his throat. No one had ever died around him before. Maybe it would pull him away from this nightmare, and back into the real world. He wasn't sure. It was the only thing that he looked away from her, ashamed to meet her gaze. If you were in any other condition, I would slap some sense into you. She grumbled while folding her arms and taking a step back so that she could look at the pitiful boy in front of her. Slowly, swallowing down his disgrace, he gazed up at her, his stupor lost for a moment. His mouth fell open slightly, and then closed before a horribly, sickly sweet smile pulled at his lips. Mixed with his sad brown eyes, Misty exhaled. You came back. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. An honest, simple statement that caught her entirely off guard. He sounded surprised. A small blush crept up over her features, and she pursed her lips angrily to drown it out. Of course I did. I wasn't just going to leave you here alone. His face scrunched up disjointedly, replacing the smile. Why? Misty's eyebrows raised and she pressed her thumb to her chin and tapped her heel on the ground gently. Why in fact, was a wonderful question. She had already been told to go home, her services no longer needed. She was free from guilt. But it was more than just that. She shrugged her shoulders. It's just who I am, she assured him, watching a grateful twinkle form in his eye and a smile tug at his lips. She dismissed this, and removed a few magazines from her purse, as well as a local newspaper, and slammed them onto the foot of his bed. I'm also not supposed to be here right now. Luckily the hospital staff cares about you, or they might not have called. She looked at her wristwatch quickly and then back at him, who thumbed the magazines nervously before looking back at her. Now, Ash Ketchum, if I get another phone call that you're trying to opt out early, I'll be back. She put 2 fingers to her eyes, and then pointed them at him. And if the dream Misty you created is anything like I really am, you know that you'll be in a world of pain. She warned him, narrowing her eyes to slits. He looked down at the magazines. They were not only battle magazines, they were world news magazines, as well as geography articles, and he sniffled as his chin started to quiver slightly in response to the kind gesture. Her face twitched as he looked up at her with those shiny, tearful doe eyes, and she had to flip her glasses on to peel her eyes away and keep her composure. I don't know what to say. He whimpered quietly, but Misty put her hands on her hips and clicked her heels. That you'll try to get better. She watched him with a dutiful gaze, her voice demanding his attention. You're not dead, Ash, and if you keep at this, you will be. So don't give up. You can do this. Ash watched her as she spoke, even beneath dark glasses. Her smile, Misty's authentic smile, was the same as he remembered it. Even though he felt like death from his 3-day fast and ashamed of himself for how he was acting, his chest burst with heat, and he returned her smile genuinely. I'll try, he assured her, but she didn't seem impressed as she shouldered her bag and moved towards the nurse who had been watching the door. She had to leave, of course, she was still under suspension. You better do more than try. I could go to jail for sneaking in here, she murmured before tossing him a quick wave, and stepping out of the room while keeping her head tucked low. Ash sat back, blinking at the door where she left, and shivered. He must have been cold because he felt numb, yet fuzzy all at the same time. Whether she realized it or not, she was a lot like how he remembered her, and it made his heart race as he placed a hand over his chest. If she was anything how he remembered her, maybe there was a small chance that he hadn't imagined everything, some part, some people, maybe, just maybe there was a small chance that they were real, too. There was hope. He turned his attention to the magazines in front of him, and opened the first page, realizing right away that if he didn't believe Misty before, he did now. He didn't know half of these words. He shuddered and ran his hand down his face, before digging into the trainer magazine, reading as many articles as he possibly could. He would just have to figure out how this world worked, and then determine where to go from there. He would figure out why this happened to him. After all, there must have been some reason, right? Misty was right, this wasn't him. His world wasn't the same, but he was the same. Ash Ketchum didn't give up. He simply couldn't. Not with his mom, Professor Oak, Pikachu, and even Gary out there. They were real, and that, Ash thought with a determined huff, was at least enough to live for until he could figure out the rest.